The Zhou people emerged from the shifting patterns of prehistoric China long before their name came to dominate the chronicles of the Middle Kingdom. Their earliest roots lie in the borderlands where culture and environment shaped a community that would eventually rise to overthrow the Shang and establish one of the longest-lasting dynasties in world history. To understand them, we must first step back into the late Neolithic age, when the lands of the Wei River Valley and the lush plateaus of northwestern China were home to scattered tribes whose survival depended on river-fed agriculture, domesticated animals, and the gradual consolidation of kinship groups into larger social structures. Archaeological remains from this period reveal communities organised around millet cultivation, supplemented by hunting, fishing, and early animal husbandry. The Zhou ancestors were not isolated, but lived in a transitional zone between the agricultural heartland of the Yellow River Basin and the pastoral frontiers stretching toward the steppes. This unique position exposed them to multiple cultural influences that would later shape their political and military outlook. Excavations at sites associated with early Zhou settlements have yielded pottery fragments, burial remains, and tools that point to a population gradually acquiring both agricultural stability and metallurgical skill. By the 2nd millennium BCE, the Zhou clans had begun to consolidate in the upper reaches of the Wei River, a fertile valley that provided both natural defences and access to the trade and communication routes connecting China's interior with the western frontiers. These geographic conditions played a crucial role in their development. Fertile soils allowed for food surpluses, while the surrounding mountains gave protection against raids and provided strategic vantage points. The Hui River itself linked them to the broader networks of the Shang world to the east. Though considered by Shang elites as a somewhat peripheral people, the Zhou absorbed many of the ritual, technological, and military practices of their more powerful neighbours, while preserving their own clan-based structures. The records preserved in transmitted texts such as the Book of Documents, alongside archaeological findings, suggest that the Zhou traced their lineage to a mythical ancestor named Hou, often remembered as the Lord of Millet. Hou's reputation as an agricultural culture hero connected the Zhou to the very basis of settled life, agriculture itself. Myths held that he taught the people how to sow grains, harness the cycles of the seasons, and offer the first fruits of harvest to the spirits. Whether historical or not, the elevation of Hou reveals how deeply the Zhou identity was tied to agriculture and ritual continuity. His cult was preserved in ancestral temples, and the kings of Zhou later claimed descent from him to legitimize their rule. Over the centuries, the Zhou clans expanded, organizing themselves into lineages ruled by chieftains who coordinated defense, ritual, and land distribution. Burial sites from this formative period indicate hierarchical distinctions already taking shape. Some graves contained elaborate bronze vessels and weaponry, while others were modest, suggesting an emerging social stratification. These early Zhou elites would become the warrior aristocracy that later enabled their conquest of the Shang. The Zhou did not live in isolation. Their position on the frontier meant constant interaction with neighbouring groups, both agricultural and pastoral. They traded, fought, and intermarried with tribes to the north and west, absorbing martial practices that emphasised horse riding and chariot warfare, skills that would prove decisive in their later rise. The gradual adoption of bronze metallurgy marked another transformative stage. While the Shang heartland remains the most famous centre of early Chinese bronze culture, the Zhou too mastered bronze casting, producing ritual vessels, weapons and tools that symbolise both authority and practical power. Bronze spearheads, daggers and chariot fittings from early Zhou contexts show that the clan chiefs commanded military forces equipped with effective weaponry. The presence of inscribed vessels, even in these early phases, suggests that ritualized authority was tied directly to bronze production. These objects were not merely utilitarian, but functioned as symbols of legitimacy, used in ceremonies that honoured ancestors and communicated with divine forces. In Shang oracle bone inscriptions, the Zhou are mentioned as a people living in the West. These records sometimes describe them as allies, sometimes as threats, reflecting the shifting alliances and rivalries of the late Shang period. The Zhou chiefs paid tribute at times and offered military assistance, but they also maintained independence. The complex relationship between Shang kings and Zhou lords laid the groundwork for future confrontation. The Zhou were learning from the Shang world while also biding their time on the frontiers, strengthening their own base of power. As the Zhou consolidated, their leadership came to be symbolized by the figure of Gugong Danfu, remembered as King Tai of Zhou. According to tradition, he moved the Zhou people from their earlier lands to a more secure position in the Wei River Valley. This migration is said to have been peaceful, carried out not by war but through careful negotiation with neighbouring tribes, displaying both diplomatic acumen and strategic foresight. Archaeological evidence suggests that such movements were common in this era, as populations shifted in response to pressure from nomadic groups or in search of more fertile lands. The narrative of King Tai, however, emphasises a deliberate relocation that positioned the Zhou in a defensible yet fertile environment where they could flourish. The story of King Tai also highlights the Zhou ethos of balancing martial readiness with moral leadership. Later records portray him as winning over his people through benevolence rather than coercion, cultivating loyalty through fairness and devotion to ancestral rituals. His reputation became a model for later Zhou kingship, which always sought to blend military strength with moral justification. This theme of moral authority, so crucial to the Zhou claim of the mandate of heaven, can already be seen in the traditions surrounding their early leaders. King Tai's descendants, including King Ji and later King Wen, expanded the Zhou base of power even further. But long before their final confrontation with the Shang, the Zhou had established themselves as a formidable presence in the Wei Valley. Their society was organized into clans and lineages with strict ancestral hierarchies, but their political system allowed for coordination across extended kin groups. This ability to unite multiple lineages under a shared leadership distinguished them from many neighbouring peoples and prepared them to confront the Shang when the opportunity arose. The Zhou cultivated not only fields but also ritual authority. Their ancestral cults were elaborate, with sacrifices conducted in accordance with carefully prescribed traditions. Bronze vessels buried in tombs or preserved in temples recorded these rituals and the lineages that performed them. The inscriptions that survive emphasize continuity, order, and legitimacy. In Zhou political thought, authority flowed from ancestors to the living, binding the present to the past in an unbroken chain. This emphasis on lineage and ritual discipline gave the Zhou a strong sense of cohesion and identity, vital for a people preparing to challenge one of the most powerful dynasties of the age. Contacts with the Shang introduced the Zhou to writing, divination practices, and the broader religious framework of the Chinese Bronze Age. While the Zhou would later present themselves as morally superior to the Shang, they borrowed heavily from Shang culture, adapting and reshaping its elements for their own purposes. They adopted oracle bone divination, though in modified forms, and they learned from Shang techniques of bronze casting, sometimes surpassing them in technical complexity. Yet they also cultivated a sense of distinction, portraying themselves as more virtuous, more restrained, and more attentive to the will of heaven. This self-image became a powerful weapon in their eventual ideological struggle against the Shang. Archaeological remains from Zhou sites show communities with planned layouts, storage facilities, and evidence of organized labor. This level of social complexity indicates that the Zhou leadership could mobilize resources effectively. They managed surplus grain, coordinated construction projects, and maintained armed forces. Such organizational capacity would be essential in mounting large-scale military campaigns later on. The Zhou lands, though not as rich as the Shang heartland along the lower Yellow River, were sufficient to support growing populations and to generate the resources required for sustained state building. The Zhou also benefited from their frontier environment by acquiring equestrian skills earlier than some of their eastern counterparts. Horses, introduced from Central Asia, transformed warfare and communication. Chariots became central to Zhou military strategy, and the elites who commanded them formed a warrior aristocracy that bound martial power with ritual authority. These aristocrats carried bronze weapons, performed ancestral sacrifices, and served as the backbone of Zhou expansion. By the time of King Wen, the Zhou were no longer a marginal people but a rising power. Their leaders had woven together strands of agriculture, metallurgy, ritual, and military organization into a cohesive system. They were ready to present themselves not only as challengers to the Shang, but as the rightful bearers of a new cosmic order. The concept of heaven, Tian, which would become central to Zhou ideology, was already beginning to take shape, providing a framework through which they could claim divine approval for their ambitions. The stage was set for confrontation, but before the open break with the Shang, the Zhou had centuries of development behind them, centuries that transformed them from scattered clans into a dynasty in waiting. Their roots in the Wei Valley, their myths of Huji, their traditions of King Tai's benevolence, and their mastery of bronze and chariot warfare gave them the foundation they needed. From this base, they would challenge the Shang, invoke the mandate of heaven, and establish a dynasty whose cultural legacy endured for nearly a millennium. And so, from these early beginnings in the western valleys of China, the Zhou people rose slowly, building strength through ritual, agriculture, and kinship. The Shang looked upon them as both ally and rival, but the balance of power was shifting. The quiet expansion of Zhou influence, the consolidation of their aristocracy, and their growing confidence in the favour of heaven were leading toward the decisive moment when they would confront and overthrow the Shang kings. This long evolution from obscure clans into a coherent political and cultural force is what set the foundation for the story that follows, where the Zhou would declare that the old dynasty had lost heaven's blessing, and they themselves were chosen to rule in its place. The Shang dynasty had reigned for centuries as the masters of the Yellow River Valley, ruling from their fortified capital at Anyang and surrounding centres of power. Their kings presided over a society that combined ritual authority, military strength, and technological mastery of bronze. Through oracle bones and bronze inscriptions, they communicated with ancestors and spirits, maintaining an elaborate system of divination that guided state decisions. Their power radiated outward through alliances and campaigns, and their armies projected dominance over neighbouring tribes. Yet beneath the surface of this grandeur lay cracks, and along the western frontier the Zhou people were growing into a formidable challenge. The Zhou had already been known to the Shang for generations, sometimes as allies offering tribute and military support, sometimes as a restless neighbour requiring vigilance. Oracle bone inscriptions from the late Shang period mention campaigns against Western tribes, with the Zhou frequently appearing in this context. At times the Shang kings summoned them to aid in military expeditions, recognising their martial value. At other times they feared them, marking them as potential threats. This unstable relationship reflected the rising power of the Zhou and the declining ability of the Shang to maintain consistent control over their wide dominion. King Wen of Zhou emerges in this context as a pivotal figure. He's remembered in tradition as a ruler who combined wisdom with strategy, laying the groundwork for the overthrow of the Shang. According to later accounts, King Wen had been enfeoffed by the Shang king as the Duke of the West, charged with guarding the western borders. In this position, he outwardly served the Shang while quietly strengthening his own base of power. He expanded Zhou influence through diplomacy, forging alliances with neighbouring tribes and states. He cultivated loyalty among his people by promoting fairness, conducting rituals with precision, and honouring both ancestors and heaven. His reputation for benevolence and foresight spread, drawing support from far beyond the Zhou heartland. Yet King Wen's growing prestige alarmed the Shang king, traditionally identified as King Zhou of Shang, whose reign has been remembered in the chronicles as tyrannical and corrupt. The contrast between the virtuous Duke of the West and the decadent Shang monarch became a central theme in Zhou ideology. Later, Confucian historians emphasized this contrast to illustrate the workings of moral legitimacy in history. King Zhou of Shang, despite his military might and ritual connections, is described as indulging in cruelty, excessive pleasures, and disregard for ancestral rites. His court became notorious for extravagance, including tales of vast wine pools and excessive feasting, while the needs of the people were neglected. Whether these accounts were exaggerated by Zhou propagandists is difficult to determine, but they served an important role in framing the Shang collapse as the result of moral failure. The imprisonment of King Wen by the Shang king forms a dramatic episode in this story. According to transmitted texts, King Zhou of Shang, suspicious of Wen's growing influence, had him detained at Yuli. The story tells that Wen's virtue won over his captors, and after offering symbolic treasures and wise counsel, he was released. This narrative not only magnified Wen's reputation, but also suggested that even imprisonment could not diminish his authority, which derived not merely from position, but from moral force. After his release, Wen returned to Zhou lands and resumed his quiet preparations for the eventual challenge to Shang rule. King Wen did not live to see the final conquest. His son, King Wu, would lead the Zhou armies to victory. But Wen laid the ideological foundation that would justify the transition. It was during this period that the Zhou developed the concept that later became known as the Mandate of Heaven. This idea held that heaven, or Tian, conferred legitimacy upon rulers not by birthright alone but by virtue and performance. A ruler who governed with justice, maintained harmony between heaven and earth, and cared for the people held the mandate. A ruler who descended into corruption, tyranny and negligence lost it. This doctrine provided a moral explanation for dynastic change. The fall of the Shang was thus not presented as a mere military coup, but as the cosmic will of heaven expressed through human events. The Mandate of Heaven differed from the Shang worldview in significant ways. The Shang had emphasized their unique relationship with their ancestors, whose spirits granted them the right to rule. Their divination practices, recorded on oracle bones, reinforced this connection. Authority was bound to the Shang royal lineage, with legitimacy derived from communication with powerful ancestral spirits. The Zhou reframed this logic. Instead of a closed lineage tied exclusively to Shang ancestors, they presented heaven as a universal overarching force that transcended one family. Heaven's favour was conditional, not guaranteed forever. By introducing this idea, the Zhou both justified their own rebellion and established a doctrine that would endure throughout Chinese history, explaining the cycle of rise and fall of dynasties for over 2,000 years. King Wu, inheriting the work of his father, assembled the Zhou and their allies for the decisive campaign. The Battle of Mui, fought around 1046 BCE, became the turning point. The Zhou army, drawn from their own forces and supported by disaffected Shang subjects and allied tribes, marched east toward the Shang capital. Accounts describe the Shang army as large but demoralized, with many soldiers defecting or refusing to fight. The Zhou warriors, led by King Wu, are said to have been inspired by the righteousness of their cause, believing they fought not just for territory, but to fulfill heaven's command. The Shang forces collapsed, and King Zhou of Shang is said to have retreated to his palace, where he set it ablaze and perished. The Zhou victory was framed immediately in cosmic terms. King Wu and his ministers declared that the Shang had lost the mandate of heaven, that their corruption and cruelty had severed the bond between ruler and heaven. The Zhou, through their virtue, their care for ritual order, and their concern for the people, had been chosen to replace them. This interpretation not only justified their conquest, but also provided a framework for their new rule. They were not simply victors in war, they were the rightful successors, guardians of the cosmic order, appointed by heaven to govern the world. The ritual and political measures taken after the conquest reinforced this claim. King Wu offered sacrifices to heaven and to the spirits of the Shang, acknowledging both continuity and rupture. He spared many Shang nobles, enfeoffing them with lands and positions, demonstrating both magnanimity and a calculated policy of inclusion. By allowing Shang descendants to continue certain rituals under Zhou oversight, he signalled that the Zhou were not destroyers, but restorers of order. They had ended tyranny, not civilization itself. The mandate of heaven soon became central to Zhou political discourse. In inscriptions on bronze vessels commissioned by Zhou elites, we find references to heaven's blessing and the duty of rulers to maintain virtue. These inscriptions served as both religious affirmations and political statements. Each vessel used in sacrifices reinforced the idea that Zhou authority was legitimate because it aligned with heaven's will. The doctrine also imposed a constant obligation. Rulers must remain virtuous or risk losing the mandate as the Shang had. This concept carried both stability and instability within it. On one hand, it legitimized Zhou rule and bound the people to accept their authority as divinely sanctioned. On the other hand, it created a precedent that any future dynasty could invoke to challenge the Zhou if they faltered. The very idea that heaven's favour was conditional introduced a principle of accountability into Chinese political thought. Kings would henceforth be judged not only by their lineage but by their conduct. The fall of the Shang and the rise of the Zhou thus mark more than a change of dynasty. They represent a transformation in the ideological foundations of Chinese rulership. The Zhou took the ritual, military and cultural practices of the Shang and reinterpreted them within a new moral framework. They preserved the grandeur of bronze culture, ancestor worship and divination, but placed them under the higher authority of heaven, accessible to any ruler who upheld virtue. This reinterpretation allowed them to justify their conquest and to present themselves as restorers of cosmic harmony rather than mere usurpers. The transition was not smooth everywhere. In the aftermath of Muye, some Shang loyalists resisted, and Zhou forces had to suppress rebellions. Yet the overarching narrative of heaven's mandate gave coherence to the Zhou project. It explained why the Shang had fallen and why the Zhou must now govern. It also provided guidance for governance. Rulers were to act with justice, avoid extravagance, care for the people, and maintain ritual propriety. Failure to do so would invite the same fate that had befallen the Shang. The story of the fall of the Shang became central to Chinese historical memory. Later dynasties would look back to it as the first clear example of the mandate of heaven in action. The Zhou's articulation of this doctrine became one of their most enduring legacies, shaping not only their own rule, but the political philosophy of all later Chinese dynasties. The concept explained the cycles of history, justified rebellion against tyrants, and held rulers to a standard of virtue that transcended personal power. In this way, the conquest at Muye was more than a military event. It was a turning point in the intellectual and spiritual history of China. The Zhou Dynasty, rising from the western frontiers, declared that heaven itself had shifted its support, and with that declaration, they redefined the meaning of kingship. The Shang had ruled by ancestral connection, the Zhou ruled by universal principle. This transformation gave their dynasty a moral authority that extended far beyond their initial conquests, setting the stage for the centuries of Zhou rule that followed. And so, as the Zhou established themselves in the old Shang lands, rebuilding authority under the mandate they claimed from heaven, the foundations were laid for the new order. The dynasty would now face the task of consolidating power, organizing a vast territory, and balancing ritual with administration. From the triumph at Muye and the doctrine of heaven's will, the Zhou moved into their formative period of rule, where the ideals they proclaimed would be tested in the practice of governance, the administration of feudal domains, and the maintenance of harmony between the human world and the cosmic order. When King Wu emerged victorious at Muye, the Zhou state faced the immense task of transforming military triumph into stable governance. The destruction of the Shang king was only the beginning. The Zhou had to prove that their claim to heaven's mandate was more than a slogan shouted on the battlefield. A dynasty had to be founded, lands administered, and a new order constructed from the ruins of an older one. The process of establishing rule after conquest required delicate balance between force and persuasion, tradition and innovation, continuity and rupture. The Zhou armies, though triumphant, were not yet fully prepared to administer the vast territories that had fallen under their authority. The Shang realm had extended across the North China plain, with fortified centres, regional elites, and established ritual networks. These were not swept away in a single stroke. Many Shang nobles remained powerful, their families entrenched in local societies. To govern effectively, King Wu needed to integrate these elites into his new order rather than attempting wholesale eradication. The Zhou leadership recognised this, and their policies after conquest reflect a deliberate strategy of inclusion and reorganisation. One of King Wu's first acts was to allow surviving members of the Shang royal house to continue performing ancestral sacrifices. He enfeoffed a Shang prince, Wu Geng, granting him lands around Yin, the former Shang capital, so that the spirits of the Shang kings would still receive offerings. This act served several purposes at once. It displayed magnanimity, showing that the Zhou did not seek to obliterate the Shang but to assume their role under heaven. It preserved ritual continuity, which was vital in a culture where ancestral rites structured legitimacy. It also created a practical arrangement, reducing resentment among Shang loyalists by giving them a place in the new order. By presenting himself not as a destroyer, but as a restorer of cosmic balance, King Wu solidified the moral authority of his conquest. At the same time, he had to secure loyalty among his own followers. The Zhou coalition that marched to Muye had been composed not only of Zhou warriors, but also of allied tribes and lords from other regions who had joined under the promise of justice and heaven's will. These allies expected reward. King Wu distributed lands and titles to those who had supported him, creating the early framework of the Zhou feudal system. Brothers, sons, and trusted generals received domains from which they would rule in the king's name. This dispersal of power both rewarded loyalty and extended Zhou authority over distant regions. By enfeoffing relatives and allies across the former Shang territories, King Wu sought to knit together a network of vassals bound by kinship, ritual, and obligation. The creation of this feudal structure was more than practical politics. It reflected Zhou ideology, which emphasized the family as the model of political order. Just as the household revolved around the patriarch and his ancestral rites, so the realm revolved around the king, who served as the patriarch of a vast familial order. Each vassal lord performed sacrifices not only to his own ancestors, but also in acknowledgement of the Zhou royal house. The system thus combined political loyalty with ritual subordination, reinforcing the idea that all authority flowed ultimately from the Zhou king under the mandate of heaven. King Wu's court also faced the challenge of consolidating the rituals that justified their rule. The Shang had long maintained elaborate divination practices, inscribing oracle bones with questions to the ancestors and interpreting the cracks after heating. The Zhou preserved aspects of this tradition but adapted it. They emphasized bronze inscriptions rather than oracle bones, recording achievements, grants of land, and ritual declarations on vessels that would be used for sacrifices. These inscriptions linked the deeds of rulers to the will of heaven, presenting their actions not as arbitrary decisions but as manifestations of cosmic order. Each bronze vessel became both a sacred object and a political document, reinforcing Zhou legitimacy at every ritual gathering. King Wu's reign was short and he did not long survive the conquest. Sources suggest he died only a few years after Muye, leaving the throne to his young son, King Shang. The premature death of the conqueror created a potential crisis. The dynasty had been proclaimed, but its foundations were still fragile. The loyalty of vassals was not yet guaranteed. Shang remnants were restless, and the new feudal system was only beginning to take shape. Into this precarious moment stepped the Duke of Zhou, King Wu's brother, who became the regent for the young king and one of the most revered figures in Chinese history. But before turning to the regency, it is worth pausing to consider what King Wu achieved in his brief rule. He established the Zhou Dynasty, not simply by force of arms, but by weaving together a political and ritual system that legitimized Zhou authority across diverse regions. His policies of inclusion, his distribution of lands and his emphasis on heaven's mandate created the framework that would endure for centuries. In many ways, his role was transitional, bridging the moment of conquest with the work of consolidation carried out by his successors. Yet his symbolic importance was immense. As the first king of Zhou, he embodied the transfer of heaven's favour from Shang to Zhou, the cosmic renewal of order after tyranny. The image of King Wu was carefully cultivated in later tradition. He was remembered as a warrior king who wielded both strength and righteousness. His victory at Mue was depicted not as brute conquest, but as a moral crusade, the overthrow of a decadent dynasty in obedience to heaven's command. Later generations of Chinese thinkers, especially Confucians, held him up as a model of virtuous rulership, combining military might with ethical justification. The narratives of his reign became foundational stories in the Chinese historical imagination, shaping ideals of kingship for centuries to come. The practical realities of his rule were more complex. The Zhou domain remained vulnerable in many regions. The loyalty of enfeoffed lords could not be taken for granted, and the old Shang heartland simmered with resentment. Rebellions erupted, requiring suppression. Shang loyalists, supported by discontented tribes, resisted Zhou authority, and campaigns had to be waged to secure the conquered territories. These struggles revealed the fragility of the new order and the difficulty of translating ideological victory into stable governance. Yet each successful suppression also reinforced the Zhou claim that heaven favoured them, since victory in war was interpreted as confirmation of divine approval. The founding of the Zhou Dynasty thus combined military strength, political ingenuity, and ideological innovation. King Wu's brief reign established the essential elements: the doctrine of heaven's mandate, the feudal system of enfeoffed lords, the integration of Shang rituals under Zhou oversight, and the moral image of a dynasty that rose to restore cosmic order. These elements gave coherence to a realm that otherwise might have fragmented under the pressures of conquest and rebellion. They also laid the foundation for the work of the Duke of Zhou, who would soon step forward to protect the dynasty during its most vulnerable years. From the moment of victory at Mue, the Zhou positioned themselves not only as rulers of territory, but as guardians of cosmic balance. King Wu, in founding the dynasty, embodied this claim. His acts of inclusion, his recognition of Shang rituals, and his creation of a kinship-based political order all served to demonstrate that Zhou rule was not arbitrary, but divinely sanctioned. His early death left unfinished tasks, but the structures he created ensured that the dynasty could survive the transition. The Zhou state, fragile yet imbued with cosmic legitimacy, was now firmly established, and the mantle of leadership would pass to the regency of the Duke of Zhou, whose efforts would further shape the destiny of the dynasty and secure its place in history. When King Wu died unexpectedly not long after the Zhou conquest, the new dynasty stood at a dangerous crossroads. His heir, King Qing, was still a child, unable to command armies or preside over the vast network of lords and vassals that had only just been bound to the Zhou order. The dangers of rebellion, intrigue, and disintegration loomed. It was in this moment that the Duke of Zhou, younger brother of King Wu and uncle to the child king, stepped into the role of regent. His actions during this period not only preserved the dynasty, but also gave it shape and definition, earning him an enduring place in Chinese political thought as the paragon of loyal service and effective governance. The Duke of Zhou, known to history as Zhou Gong, had already been a key figure during the conquest. He had commanded troops, assisted in strategy, and stood alongside his brother in declaring the righteousness of their cause. After King Wu's death, he became the central figure holding the fragile Zhou state together. His authority as regent was not uncontested. Other brothers of King Wu, particularly the so-called Three Guards, who had been stationed in the former Shang lands to oversee conquered populations, grew suspicious of his intentions. They feared that the Duke of Zhou, by assuming regency, might be tempted to seize the throne for himself. This suspicion led to open rebellion.
supported by remnants of the Shang elite still loyal to their fallen dynasty. The rebellion of the Three Guards, joined by Shang Prince Wu Geng, and aided by discontented tribes from the east, tested the foundations of Zhou power. The Duke of Zhou responded with decisiveness. Acting in the name of the young king, he led campaigns to suppress the insurgents, mobilizing the loyalty of Zhou allies and the discipline of Zhou armies. The wars were hard fought, but ultimately the Duke prevailed. The Shang remnant was crushed, Wu Geng was executed, and the rebellious brothers were defeated. This victory not only secured the dynasty against its most immediate threat, but also proved that the mandate of heaven still favoured Zhou. The Duke's success in quelling rebellion solidified his authority as regent and demonstrated his loyalty. For rather than usurping the throne, he restored stability for his nephew. In the aftermath of these conflicts, the Duke of Zhou turned to the work of consolidation. He established a permanent Zhou capital at Chengzhou, near modern Luoyang, which became a secondary centre complementing the western homeland in the Wei River Valley. This relocation into the heart of the old Shang domains symbolised Zhou determination to integrate the conquered territories into their order. Chengzhou was constructed with careful attention to ritual and cosmology. Its layout reflected principles of orientation and hierarchy, embodying the Zhou vision of a cosmos ordered around the king at its centre. The choice of location also allowed for tighter control over the eastern territories, ensuring that the Shang legacy would be supervised directly by the Zhou court. The Duke of Zhou also systematised the feudal order. The initial enfeoffments granted by King Wu were expanded and formalised. Dozens of domains were established, ruled by Zhou relatives, allies, and loyal clans. These fiefs stretched across the North China Plain, from the Shang heartland eastward to newly incorporated regions. Each lord governed his domain but owed allegiance, ritual recognition, and military support to the Zhou king. The Duke emphasised that this hierarchy was not merely political, but also moral and cosmological. The king was the son of heaven, standing between Tian and humanity, and the lords were his younger kin, bound to him as the members of a family are bound to a patriarch. The system fused kinship with governance, creating an enduring model of political order that lasted for centuries. Ritual played a central role in the Duke of Zhou's vision. He's credited with codifying ceremonies, rites, and sacrificial practices that defined the Zhou court. The rituals of the royal house became the model for all vassals. By regulating sacrifices, music, and ceremonial conduct, the Duke bound the elite into a shared cultural and religious order. These rites emphasized hierarchy, deference, and the centrality of the Zhou king. They also reinforced the mandate of heaven doctrine, presenting each performance of ritual as a renewal of the bond between heaven and the royal house. The careful codification of these practices would later be remembered in texts attributed to the Zhou, forming the basis of the ritual classics that influenced Chinese philosophy for centuries. In his regency, the Duke of Zhou also articulated and refined the ideological foundation of Zhou rule. He proclaimed that heaven's mandate was not eternal for any single family but depended on virtue. The fall of the Shang had been the result of tyranny and excess, and the Zhou would remain secure only so long as they ruled with justice, benevolence, and reverence for heaven. This principle, enshrined in speeches and inscriptions from his time, became one of the most influential ideas in Chinese history. It provided both a justification for Zhou conquest and a warning to future Zhou kings, reminding them that their authority was conditional upon moral conduct. The mandate of heaven was not simply propaganda. It was a living doctrine that guided governance and shaped historical interpretation. Bronze inscriptions from this period reflect the Duke of Zhou's efforts to tie ritual, politics, and ideology together. Vessels cast to commemorate victories or grants of land often include declarations of heaven's favour, warnings about the need for virtue, and expressions of loyalty to the royal house. These inscriptions served as permanent reminders of the responsibilities of rulers and the sacred nature of Zhou authority. They also functioned as historical records, preserving the events and principles of the early Zhou for posterity. The Duke of Zhou's regency was not only about suppressing rebellion and codifying rituals, it was also about building institutions. He organised the bureaucracy of the royal court, appointing ministers and officials to oversee ritual, military affairs, agriculture, and justice. The Zhou state could not be held together by kinship alone. Administrative systems were needed to coordinate resources, regulate tribute, and enforce order. The duke's establishment of these offices provided the dynasty with the machinery of governance that allowed it to function across a wide and diverse territory. The memory of the Duke of Zhou was shaped by later generations into a symbol of loyal service. Confucius, centuries later, revered him as the ideal minister, who could have seized the throne but chose instead to preserve it for the rightful heir. In the Confucian tradition, the Duke embodied the virtue of loyalty to both family and principle, a model for ministers who served kings. He was remembered as both a warrior and a sage, a regent who suppressed rebellion, and a philosopher who articulated the moral foundation of rulership. His combination of practical skill and ethical vision made him a figure of enduring importance in Chinese political thought, but beyond the idealized image, the Duke's actual achievements were concrete and lasting. He suppressed the most dangerous rebellion of the early dynasty, ensuring its survival. He founded a secondary capital in the east, securing the integration of the Shang lands. He systematized the feudal order, binding lords into a network of ritual and political obligations. He codified rituals and refined the doctrine of heaven's mandate, giving the dynasty its ideological backbone. He built administrative institutions that allowed the court to function effectively. Without his regency, the Zhou dynasty might have collapsed in its infancy. With it, the dynasty not only survived but flourished, establishing a model of rulership that influenced all of Chinese history. As King Shang came of age, the Duke of Zhou stepped back from regency, returning authority to the rightful ruler. This act of relinquishing power confirmed his reputation for loyalty and set a precedent for the legitimacy of the Zhou royal line. The dynasty emerged from its early crisis not only intact but strengthened. The image of a virtuous regent safeguarding the throne became part of Zhou identity, and a story retold in subsequent generations to illustrate the ideals of governance. The early Zhou court, shaped by the duke's regency, became a centre of ritual authority, political coordination, and ideological innovation. From the capitals of Haojing in the west and Chengzhou in the east, the kings presided over a network of vassals bound by kinship, ritual, and the mandate of heaven. The court ceremonies reaffirmed the cosmic order, its bureaucracy managed the affairs of state, and its ideology provided both justification and warning for rulership. The system was complex, fragile, and dependent on balance, but under the guidance of the Duke of Zhou it took firm root. From this foundation, the Zhou dynasty entered its mature phase, with kings who could now preside over a functioning order. The regency had shown that heaven's favour could be maintained through virtue and effective governance, and the dynasty stood as proof that moral authority could guide political power. The role of the Duke of Zhou was thus not only a matter of historical necessity, but also of enduring symbolic importance, setting the tone for how the dynasty understood itself and how later generations would remember the nature of legitimate rule. When the Zhou dynasty stabilized under the leadership of King Shang and the regency of the Duke of Zhou, the focus shifted from immediate survival to the building of lasting institutions. Among the most important achievements of this early period was the establishment of Haojing as the primary royal capital in the west, near present-day Xi'an. This site became not only the political centre of the dynasty, but also the ceremonial heart of Zhou ritual life. It embodied the Zhou vision of kingship as both a practical authority over men and a sacred duty under heaven. The layout of Haojing, the rituals conducted there, and the life of the court all reveal how the Zhou sought to translate the abstract idea of the mandate of heaven into a lived and enduring system of governance. The choice of Haojing as the seat of power was deliberate. Situated in the fertile Wei River Valley, it lay at the centre of Zhou ancestral lands, surrounded by mountains that provided natural defences and enriched soils, ideal for cultivation. Its location allowed the dynasty to secure its western heartland, while also maintaining communication with the newly subdued eastern territories. The capital itself was constructed with an attention to cosmological symbolism. Archaeological remains and transmitted descriptions suggest a city organised with ordered avenues, palace complexes, ancestral temples, and ritual altars aligned according to cardinal directions. This reflected the Zhou belief that political order should mirror cosmic order. Just as heaven governed the universe with harmony and hierarchy, so the Zhou king governed the human realm with symmetry and ritual propriety. At the core of Haojing stood the royal palace, not only a residence but also the stage for ceremonies that reaffirmed the king's role as the son of heaven. Nearby stood the ancestral temples, where sacrifices to Zhou forebears were performed with solemn precision. These rituals tied the living dynasty to its legendary ancestors, from Huji the Lord of Millet to King Wen and King Wu. The temples served as the dynastic memory, preserving the lineage and providing continuity across generations. Each ceremony carried profound meaning. Offerings of grain, wine, or animal sacrifice were gestures of respect to the dead, but also affirmations of legitimacy for the living. To neglect them would risk losing heaven's favour, for in Zhou thought the ancestors acted as intermediaries between the human world and Tian. The royal court gathered in Haojing to participate in these ceremonies, which extended beyond the immediate royal family to include nobles, ministers, and vassals. Attendance at ritual was both a duty and a privilege, reinforcing bonds of loyalty to the king. These events were accompanied by carefully arranged music, dance, and processions. Ritual music, remembered in later tradition as one of the classical arts, was not entertainment, but a means of harmonizing the human spirit with the rhythms of the cosmos. Bells, chimes, drums, and flutes combined in sequences believed to reflect natural balance, calming the minds of participants and aligning them with heaven's order. The choreography of ritual movement reinforced hierarchy, with each participant occupying a place determined by rank and role. Through repetition, the Zhou court enacted the very principles that underpinned their political system. Haojing was more than a ceremonial site. It was also the administrative hub where decrees were issued, envoys received, and decisions taken that affected the far-flung domains of the Zhou realm. Bronze inscriptions from this period record the granting of lands, rewards for service, and admonitions to uphold virtue. These inscriptions were not private records but public declarations, often cast on vessels used in ritual feasts where nobles gathered. The distribution of food and drink at such feasts was itself a ritual act, symbolizing the king's role as provider and unifier. By feasting together from vessels inscribed with proclamations of heaven's mandate, the Zhou elite internalized the legitimacy of the dynasty and reaffirmed their obligations. The daily life of Haojing reflected the intertwining of ritual and governance. Ministers oversaw agriculture, ensuring the timely collection of tribute and the organization of seasonal labor. The economy depended heavily on millet cultivation, supplemented by wheat and barley introduced from the west and supported by livestock raising. Agricultural surplus sustained the court, funded the construction of palaces and temples, and supported the armies needed to suppress rebellion or defend borders. Each harvest season was accompanied by ceremonies of thanksgiving, where the first grains were offered to ancestors before distribution to the living. In this way, even the most basic economic activities were bound to the ritual order. The Zhou also integrated conquered peoples into the ritual life of Haojing. Envoys from distant fiefs brought tribute not only as material resources, but as tokens of loyalty. Their participation in royal ceremonies bound them to the dynasty, acknowledging the supremacy of the Zhou king. The inclusion of diverse groups under a common ritual framework helped to unify a realm that otherwise might have fragmented under regional loyalties. This was one of the great achievements of the early Zhou court, the creation of a shared cultural order in which participation in ritual became as important as obedience in politics. The concept of Tian, or heaven, remained central to Haojing's life. Every decision, whether military, political, or economic, was framed in relation to heaven's will. The king was not an absolute ruler by personal right, but the mediator between heaven and humanity. His duty was to maintain harmony by conducting rituals properly, governing justly, and ensuring the prosperity of the people. Failure in these duties risked natural disasters, rebellion, or loss of legitimacy. Thus, the ceremonies of Haojing were not ornamental. They were the mechanism by which the dynasty claimed to maintain cosmic balance. When omens appeared, such as eclipses or unusual weather, they were interpreted as warnings from heaven, prompting the king to perform additional rituals of atonement or to issue reforms. Music and dance at the Zhou court carried a philosophical dimension. Later Confucian texts would recall the Zhou rituals as the height of harmonious civilization, contrasting them with both the excesses of the Shang and the disorder of later times. The music of Haojing was remembered not for its beauty alone, but for its ability to cultivate virtue. By listening and participating, nobles were trained in restraint, harmony, and respect for order. The belief that music could shape character and politics made it central to the Zhou vision of rulership. Each performance was a lesson in hierarchy and morality, enacted through sound and movement. The architecture of Haojing also reflected Zhou ideals. The alignment of palaces, temples, and altars according to cardinal directions symbolized the connection between human order and cosmic patterns. The king sat facing south, the traditional orientation of Chinese rulers, signifying openness to the people and alignment with the course of the sun. Altars to heaven and earth marked the dynasty's responsibility to maintain balance between cosmic forces. By embedding these principles into the very structure of their capital, the Zhou ensured that daily life constantly reminded both rulers and subjects of their place in the larger order of things. The role of the royal household in Haojing was also deeply tied to ritual. The queen and consorts participated in ceremonies related to fertility, harvest, and the honouring of female ancestors. Their roles underscored the importance of balance between male and female principles in sustaining cosmic harmony. Royal marriages were often arranged to cement alliances with powerful families, ensuring political unity while also incorporating new lineages into the ritual order. The presence of these women in ceremonies emphasized that the dynasty's legitimacy was rooted in both paternal and maternal lines of ancestry. Haojing also served as the stage for the education of young princes and nobles. Training in ritual, music, archery and charioteering prepared them not only for leadership but for moral conduct. The Zhou believed that governing required cultivation of virtue as much as martial skill. By teaching the next generation within the ceremonial environment of Haojing, the dynasty ensured continuity of its ideals. The sons of vassal lords who spent time at the court absorbed Zhou culture, which they carried back to their domains, spreading common practices and reinforcing unity. The court of Haojing was not without tensions. Ambitious nobles sometimes resisted central authority, while the demands of ritual could strain resources. Yet the system held because it created a shared framework of meaning. The king's authority was not enforced by military power alone, but sanctified by the rituals that all nobles recognized as binding. The belief that heaven had entrusted the Zhou with the mandate provided a unifying principle that transcended local rivalries. Participation in Haojing ceremonies was both a privilege and a duty, binding lords together in a common recognition of the king's role as son of heaven. Over time, Haojing became a symbol of Western Zhou order. Its rituals, music, and institutions defined what it meant to rule legitimately in China. Later dynasties would look back on the early Zhou court as a golden age of harmony between heaven and humanity, where rulers governed with virtue and rituals aligned human affairs with cosmic principles. Whether this idealized image fully matched the realities of daily life is uncertain, but the legacy of Haojing endured in memory and in the ritual texts that transmitted Zhou practices to later generations. From its palaces and temples, the Zhou kings ruled a realm that stretched farther than any Chinese dynasty before them. The court of Haojing orchestrated ceremonies that connected the living with the dead, the human with the divine, the local with the universal. In this way, the Zhou transformed conquest into civilization, binding diverse peoples into a single ritual and political order. The dynasty, through the life of its capital, expressed its identity as the mediator of heaven's mandate, sustaining harmony through ceremonies that became the foundation of Chinese culture for centuries. The Zhou dynasty did not seek to govern its vast realm through a centralized bureaucracy as later dynasties would attempt. Instead, the early Zhou rulers built their state on a foundation of kinship, hierarchy, and reciprocal obligation. Their system of governance has often been described as feudal, though it differed in many ways from the feudalism of medieval Europe. At its core, it was a political order modelled on the family. The king stood at the apex as the son of heaven, the ultimate patriarch of the realm. Beneath him were layers of lords, nobles, and vassals, each enfeoffed with land, entrusted with ritual duties, and bound by oaths of loyalty. This arrangement allowed the Zhou to extend their control over a wide territory without attempting direct administration, but it also created tensions that would shape the dynasty's future. The roots of this system lay in the immediate aftermath of conquest. King Wu and the Duke of Zhou faced the challenge of securing loyalty across regions formerly loyal to the Shang. To accomplish this, they distributed lands to trusted relatives, allies, and distinguished followers. Each recipient of land became a lord, expected to rule his domain, collect tribute, provide military support, and uphold Zhou rituals. The enfeoffments created a vast network of domains, some large and powerful, others small and symbolic, but all tied theoretically to the Zhou king. The principle was that of kinship extended outward. The closer a lord was in blood relation to the royal house, the greater his prestige and often the size of his fief. This kinship model was reinforced through the rituals of succession and obligation. When a lord received a domain, he was granted not only land but also bronze vessels, inscribed with records of the king's favour. These vessels were used in sacrifices to ancestors, reminding each lord that his authority came not from personal conquest, but from the king's recognition, which itself derived from heaven. Thus, even at the periphery of the realm, the presence of Zhou ritual objects tied lords back to the royal centre. Participation in royal ceremonies at Haojing and Chengzhou further reinforced these bonds, creating a rhythm of obligation that bound the aristocracy to the dynasty. The hierarchy of the feudal order was complex. At the top stood the king, the only figure who bore the title Son of Heaven. Below him were the great lords, often his brothers, sons, or close relatives, ruling major fiefs. Beneath them were lesser nobles, some of Zhou descent, others from allied clans, governing smaller territories. At the local level, lineages controlled villages, bound by ancestral ties and obligations to higher lords. This multi-layered structure extended Zhou authority without requiring a centralized state. Each layer mirrored the family structure, with loyalty flowing upward like filial piety, and protection and favour flowing downward like paternal care. One of the distinctive features of the Zhou system was the creation of ritualized ranks among the nobility. Later remembered as the 5 ranks of nobility, Duke, Marquis, Earl, Viscount, and Baron. These titles distinguished degrees of prestige and authority among the lords. While the exact implementation of this system is debated, the principle of hierarchical ranks reinforced the idea that the realm was an ordered family. Each noble knew his place in relation to the king and to one another. Authority was defined not only by military power, but by recognition within this ritual hierarchy. The feudal system also extended into military obligations. When the king called for war, vassal lords were expected to provide troops, chariots, and supplies. These levies allowed the Zhou to mobilize large armies without maintaining a permanent centralized force. At the same time, the obligation bound lords to the dynasty, for to fail in military service was to violate both political duty and ritual obligation. Victories in war reinforced the bonds, as lords were rewarded with land, titles and bronze vessels. Defeats, on the other hand, could lead to censure or redistribution of lands. The military dimension of the feudal order ensured that Zhou kings could project power far beyond their immediate territory. But it also meant that their authority depended heavily on the loyalty and competence of their vassals. The distribution of land under the feudal system was not uniform. Some fiefs, like those granted to close royal relatives, became large and influential states in their own right. Others were small enclaves, strategically placed to guard frontiers or monitor conquered peoples. The diversity of these domains meant that the Zhou realm was a mosaic of semi-autonomous units, each with its own traditions and local loyalties, but all bound to the king through kinship and ritual. The cohesion of the system depended on the ability of the royal house to command respect and to maintain regular contact through ceremonies, inspections and communication. At the heart of the feudal order was the idea that political authority was inseparable from ritual responsibility. A lord did not simply govern land and people, he maintained altars, conducted sacrifices, and upheld the moral order. His legitimacy came from his ability to fulfill these duties in harmony with the Zhou king. Inscriptions from this period frequently emphasize that lords were charged to act with virtue, to govern fairly, and to preserve the mandate of heaven in their domains. In this sense, each lord was a miniature reflection of the king, ruling his fief as the king ruled the realm, but always within the larger framework of heaven's order mediated by the royal house. The lives of the nobles were deeply structured by ritual obligations. Seasonal sacrifices, feasts and ceremonies punctuated the year, each occasion reinforcing the ties between lords and king. At royal gatherings, lords brought tribute of grain, textiles or bronze, and in return received gifts that symbolize royal favour. These exchanges were both material and symbolic, binding the aristocracy into a network of mutual obligation. The court at Haojing became the centre where these relationships were affirmed, but the echoes of its rituals extended outward into every fief, creating a shared culture that held the realm together. The feudal order also shaped social hierarchy beyond the nobility. Within each domain, local lineages governed villages, maintaining their own ancestral rights and obligations. At the base were commoners who farmed the land, producing the millet and wheat that sustained both local lords and the royal court. Though not participants in the higher rituals of Haojing, these commoners were still integrated into the system, for their agricultural labour provided the material basis for sacrifices and feasts. In Zhou ideology, every level of society had its place, from king to farmer, all bound together by obligations that mirrored the structure of the cosmos. Over time, the feudal system allowed the Zhou to govern a realm larger than any Chinese dynasty before them. Yet it carried inherent risks. By granting substantial autonomy to powerful lords, the Zhou planted the seeds of future challenges. Some domains grew wealthy and militarily strong, developing identities that were increasingly independent of the royal court. The reliance on kinship ties worked well in the first generations, when living memory of King Wu and the Duke of Zhou bound the aristocracy together. But as generations passed, the bonds of blood thinned, and loyalty became more fragile. Still, in its early centuries, the feudal order functioned as the mechanism by which the Zhou maintained unity across vast territories. The nobles themselves formed a distinct aristocratic culture. They were warrior elites, skilled in chariot warfare, archery and ritual. Their identity was bound up with bronze vessels, ancestral temples, and music that reflected their rank. Marriages between noble houses reinforced alliances, creating a web of kinship that extended across the realm. The aristocracy saw themselves not merely as local rulers, but as participants in a broader Zhou civilization, bound to the king by shared rituals and by the constant invocation of heaven's mandate. This sense of belonging to a common culture helped sustain the system, even as local interests sometimes diverged. The vassal lords also acted as intermediaries between the Zhou court and peripheral peoples. On the frontiers, they managed relations with non-Zhou tribes, conducting diplomacy, trade, and warfare. In this way, the feudal order expanded the reach of Zhou culture beyond its immediate boundaries, gradually assimilating diverse populations into the ritual and political framework of the dynasty. Bronze inscriptions from frontier states reveal both pride in their local identity and constant reference to the Zhou king, demonstrating the dual role of autonomy and allegiance that characterized the system. The king himself, at the center of this structure, remained the ultimate authority. His role was to mediate between heaven and humanity, ensuring that rituals were conducted properly, that justice was upheld, and that the realm remained in harmony. When lords gathered at Haojing, they acknowledged his supremacy, bringing tribute and participating in ceremonies that affirm the unity of the realm. Yet the king's authority was not absolute. It depended on his ability to command respect, to demonstrate virtue, and to maintain heaven's favour. The feudal order functioned only so long as the king fulfilled these responsibilities. The system of kings, nobles, and vassals defined the Western Zhou for centuries. It allowed the dynasty to project authority across a vast territory without centralized administration, relying instead on kinship, ritual, and obligation. It created a powerful aristocracy that both supported and constrained the king. It embedded political authority in religious and moral frameworks that gave legitimacy to the dynasty, and it laid the foundations for Chinese political culture, where the idea of hierarchy as family and of rulership as moral responsibility would endure long after the Zhou themselves had faded. The Zhou dynasty's strength did not rest solely on armies and rituals. Beneath the grandeur of Haojing's palaces and the ceremonials of the aristocracy lay the steady labour of fields, furnaces, and workshops. Agriculture formed the foundation of the Western Zhou economy, feeding the population, supporting the armies, and providing the surpluses that allowed for ritual offerings and courtly display. Bronze technology, inherited from the Shang but expanded under the Zhou, became both a practical tool and a symbol of authority. Together, these elements created the economic base that sustained the feudal order and gave the dynasty its material power. The heart of Zhou agriculture was the millet field. Millet had long been the staple crop of northern China, resilient in the less soils of the Yellow River Basin and adaptable to varying rainfall. Its cultivation defined the agricultural cycle of the Zhou year. Fields were ploughed with simple wooden or bronze-tipped implements, seeded by hand and harvested with sickles. Labour was organised through lineages and households, each responsible for maintaining its share of the fields. The produce supported not only the family but also the obligations of tribute to lords and king. Grain was more than food. It was the substance of ritual offerings, the currency of taxation, and the resource that underpinned political power. Alongside millet, wheat and barley, introduced from western regions centuries earlier, gained increasing importance. These crops offered dietary variety and resilience against climatic fluctuations. Wheat, with its different growing season, allowed for more efficient use of land and labour, providing a buffer against famine. Barley added further diversity, though millet remained dominant. Together, these grains formed the staples of Zhou diet and economy. The Zhou also cultivated hemp for textiles, soybeans for food and soil enrichment, and various vegetables to supplement their diet. Orchards and mulberry groves were common, providing fruits and the silk that would later become central to Chinese economy and culture. Animal husbandry played a vital role in Zhou agriculture. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats provided meat, hides, and labour. Horses, introduced from the steppes, transformed both agriculture and warfare. Chariots, the hallmark of Zhou aristocratic warfare, required trained horses, and their breeding became a matter of prestige and necessity. Oxen pulled ploughs and carts, increasing agricultural productivity. Pigs and chickens were common in village households, forming part of daily sustenance. Sheep and goats grazed on marginal lands, contributing to wool and milk production. Each animal had its place in the economic cycle, integrated into both subsistence and ritual. The organisation of agricultural labour reflected the social hierarchy. Noble households commanded large estates, worked by dependents who owed service as part of their obligations. Commoners farmed their own plots but contributed labour or produce to their lords. The system was structured to ensure that surpluses flowed upward, sustaining the aristocracy and court. Tribute took the form of grain, animals, textiles, and bronze, collected through the network of vassals and redistributed by the king as rewards and gifts. In this way, the agricultural base supported the entire political and ritual order. The Zhou also practiced a distinctive field system, later remembered as the well-field arrangement. According to this model, a square of land was divided into 9 equal sections, with 8 worked by individual families and the central plot farmed collectively for the benefit of the lord or the state. Whether this system was universally applied or more of an idealized model is debated, but it reflects the Zhou emphasis on shared labour and obligation. The idea symbolized the integration of individual households into the larger structure of society, mirroring the feudal order on a local scale. Each farmer worked his own land, but also contributed to the collective responsibility that sustained his community and rulers. Storage and distribution of grain were critical to Zhou governance. Granaries were maintained at both local and central levels, ensuring reserves for times of famine or war. Tribute grain collected from villages and fiefs filled the royal granaries at Haojing, supporting the court and the army. The management of these reserves required careful administration, overseen by officials who measured, recorded, and safeguarded the stores. Ritual offerings to ancestors often involved presenting the first fruits of harvest, linking agricultural productivity directly to the favour of heaven. When harvests failed, kings and lords were expected to perform rituals of atonement, acknowledging their responsibility for cosmic harmony. Beyond subsistence, the Zhou economy included craft production, particularly in bronze technology. Bronze was the material of both utility and prestige, used for weapons, tools, vessels, and ornaments. The techniques of casting inherited from the Shang reached new heights under the Zhou, producing objects of greater size, complexity, and artistic refinement. Workshops near the capital and in major fiefs employed skilled artisans who worked under the patronage of nobles. The production of bronze required coordination of mining, smelting, and casting, drawing resources from diverse regions into the hands of the aristocracy. The practical uses of bronze included ploughshares, sickles, knives, and axes, which improved agricultural efficiency. Bronze weapons, spears, daggers, swords, and arrowheads, equipped the armies of lords and king, ensuring military supremacy over neighbouring tribes. But it was in ritual vessels that bronze reached its greatest symbolic importance. Tripods, cauldrons, wine jars, and libation cups were cast in intricate forms, often inscribed with dedicatory texts. These vessels were used in sacrifices, feasts, and ancestral rites, serving as both sacred objects and markers of status. To possess a great bronze cauldron was to possess the means of communion with ancestors and heaven, and therefore to hold legitimate authority. Bronze inscriptions from the Western Zhou provide invaluable records of the dynasty's economy and politics. They commemorate grants of land, rewards for service, and declarations of royal favour. They record victories in war, appointments to office, and warnings about virtue. These inscriptions show how deeply intertwined bronze was with the fabric of Zhou society. Each vessel was both a tool of ritual and a document of history, carrying the memory of events into future generations. The possession and display of bronzes reinforced the status of noble lineages, binding them to the dynasty through shared culture and ideology. The production of bronze depended on extensive networks of resource extraction. Copper and tin, the essential components, had to be mined and transported from distant regions. This required organisation and trade, connecting the Zhou heartland to peripheral areas. Control over these resources was both an economic necessity and a political advantage. Domains that could access mines or trade routes gained power, while the royal court sought to maintain oversight to prevent excessive independence. The flow of metal into workshops symbolized the integration of the realm, as diverse lands contributed to the material basis of Zhou authority. The artistry of Zhou bronzes reflected the values of the dynasty. Designs included touty masks inherited from the Shang, but also new motifs emphasizing order and symmetry. Inscriptions often highlighted loyalty, service, and the king's role as mediator of heaven's mandate. The vessels were displayed at feasts where lords and vassals gathered, transforming meals into ceremonies of political and cosmic significance. To drink from a bronze cup inscribed with royal favour was to participate in the affirmation of Zhou legitimacy. In this way, bronze technology was not only economic but profoundly ideological. The economy of the Western Zhou was not limited to agriculture and bronze. Textiles, especially hemp and silk, played an important role. Hemp provided sturdy fabric for everyday clothing, while silk, though rare, was already valued as a symbol of refinement. Weaving was largely a domestic craft, carried out by women in noble and common households alike. The production of textiles supplemented agricultural income, with surplus cloth serving as tribute or exchange. Trade in textiles, bronze and agricultural products connected fiefs to the royal court and to each other, creating an interdependent economic network. Markets existed in towns and near the capital, where artisans, farmers and traders exchanged goods. Though not yet highly monetized, the economy allowed for circulation of commodities, redistribution of surpluses, and specialization of labor. Craftsmen in bronze, jade, bone, and pottery developed skills that distinguished the Zhou realm as a center of material culture. The economy was primarily agrarian, but the diversification of production supported the complexity of aristocratic life and the demands of ritual. The integration of economy, agriculture, and technology into the Zhou worldview was profound. Every harvest, every casting of bronze, every distribution of tribute was framed in relation to heaven's mandate. Prosperity was not merely a material condition, but a sign of cosmic harmony. Famine or scarcity signalled imbalance, calling for ritual correction. Wealth and surpluses were justified not for personal luxury, but for the maintenance of ancestral sacrifices and the stability of the realm. The aristocracy's privileges were bound to their responsibilities, for to fail in providing for ritual or to misuse resources risked the loss of legitimacy. This blending of economy and ideology meant that the Zhou dynasty's material foundations were inseparable from its political order. Agriculture provided the food that sustained people and sacrifices. Bronze provided the weapons that defended the dynasty, and the vessels that legitimized it. Tribute and redistribution reinforced the hierarchy of lords and king. The entire structure rested on the steady labour of farmers, herders and artisans, whose work maintained the flow of resources upward into the rituals and governance of the aristocracy. The stability of the dynasty was therefore always tied to the productivity of its fields and the control of its metals. In the Western Zhou, the prosperity of agriculture and the mastery of bronze technology enabled the dynasty to sustain its elaborate rituals and to project its authority across vast territories. These foundations allowed the dynasty to flourish, but they also carried vulnerabilities. Dependence on tribute made the dynasty reliant on the loyalty of vassals. Control of metal resources created competition among domains. Agricultural productivity depended on weather and labour discipline. Yet as long as the system held, the Zhou kings could present themselves as the chosen mediators of heaven, sustained by the bounty of earth and the brilliance of bronze. The Zhou dynasty framed its rule not only through political and economic structures, but through a religious vision that placed its kings at the centre of communication between the human world and the forces of the cosmos. At the heart of this vision stood the concept of Tian, often translated as heaven, alongside the practices of ancestor worship that bound living lineages to their departed forebears. These ideas and rituals gave the dynasty its ideological coherence, providing a framework that explained both its rise to power and the responsibilities of kingship. Religion in the Zhou age was not a separate domain of belief, but was inseparable from governance, agriculture, and society. Every act of authority was also an act of ritual, and every success or failure in the realm was interpreted through the lens of divine favour or disfavour. Ancestor worship was the most pervasive element of Zhou religious life. Families maintained ancestral temples where tablets or ritual vessels represented deceased forebears. Sacrifices of food, drink and animals were offered to these ancestors, who were believed to continue influencing the living. For common families, the scale was modest, limited to a few generations of forebears, but for noble lineages and especially for the royal house, the cult of ancestors extended back into mythic time. The Zhou kings traced their lineage to Hou Ji, the lord of millet, remembered as a culture hero who introduced agriculture. By performing sacrifices to him and to their more immediate royal ancestors, the kings affirmed their continuity with a divine order, stretching from primordial times to the present. The practice of ancestor worship was more than personal devotion. It was the very foundation of legitimacy. Authority in Zhou society was bound to lineage. To govern was to honour the ancestors properly, for their blessings sustained prosperity, fertility, and victory in war. Neglecting ancestral sacrifices could bring disaster, for the dead were thought to withdraw their protection if dishonoured. Thus, the rituals performed in temples and on altars were political acts. When a king or noble offered a sacrifice, he was reaffirming his right to rule. The possession of grand ancestral temples and the ability to conduct elaborate sacrifices distinguished the aristocracy from commoners, reinforcing social hierarchy. The ceremonies of ancestor worship were intricate. Bronze vessels were filled with offerings of wine, millet, and meat, their surfaces inscribed with text commemorating deeds and divine favour. Music and dance accompanied the offerings, transforming the rituals into orchestrated performances that harmonized participants with cosmic rhythms. The living family gathered before the spirits of the dead, reciting prayers and presenting gifts, after which the food might be consumed in a communal feast. This blending of sacred and social reinforced solidarity within the lineage. By eating together in the presence of the ancestors, the living reaffirmed their unity and continuity with the past. The Zhou also maintained altars to natural forces, such as heaven, earth, the mountains, and the rivers. Sacrifices to heaven were especially significant, for Tian was not conceived merely as a natural phenomenon, but as a moral force that governed the order of the world. The Zhou presented Tian as the ultimate source of authority, a power that watched over humanity and judged rulers according to their virtue. This was the foundation of the Mandate of Heaven doctrine. Unlike the Shang, who emphasized their exclusive connection to royal ancestors, the Zhou elevated Tian as a universal principle. In doing so, they framed their conquest of the Shang as the result of cosmic justice, rather than personal ambition. Tian in the Zhou worldview was not a distant, abstract sky deity, but an active participant in human affairs. It granted prosperity, fertility, and victory to rulers who governed justly, and it withdrew support from those who fell into corruption or tyranny. Natural disasters, crop failures, or rebellions were interpreted as signs that the ruler had lost favour. To restore balance, kings performed rituals of atonement, issuing proclamations of reform or undertaking acts of piety. In this way, Tian served both as a source of legitimacy and as a check on rulers, reminding them that their authority was conditional upon moral conduct. The intertwining of Tian and ancestor worship created a dual foundation for Zhou religion. Ancestors provided continuity and lineage-based legitimacy, while Tian provided universal and moral legitimacy. The king stood at the intersection of these two domains. As son of heaven, he mediated between Tian and the human world, ensuring cosmic harmony through ritual. As head of the royal lineage, he honoured ancestors who conferred blessings on his reign. His authority was thus both familial and cosmic, rooted in tradition and sustained by heaven's ongoing judgment. Ritual texts from the Zhou period, preserved in later compilations, describe the precision with which ceremonies were conducted. The correct time of day, the correct orientation of altars, the correct sequence of offerings, all mattered deeply. Missteps in ritual were considered dangerous, potentially angering spirits or disrupting harmony. The Zhou court invested immense energy into training ritual specialists, musicians and officials who ensured the flawless execution of ceremonies. This attention to detail reflected the belief that human order mirrored cosmic order. Just as the heavens followed regular cycles, so too must human ritual follow strict patterns. The role of music in Zhou religion deserves emphasis. Bells, chimes, and drums were arranged to produce tones that reflected harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. Dance movements mirrored cosmic rhythms, enacting the balance of yin and yang, light and dark, male and female. These performances were not entertainment, but sacred acts that tuned the participants to the order of the universe. The Zhou belief that music cultivated virtue gave these ceremonies a moral dimension. Nobles trained in ritual music were thought to become more disciplined, harmonious, and just in their governance. Thus, the rituals of Haojing were as much about moral cultivation as about appeasing spirits. The concept of Tian also influenced the Zhou understanding of law and morality. While the Shang had emphasized divination to seek guidance from ancestors, the Zhou increasingly presented moral conduct as the determinant of heaven's favour. Kings were expected to rule with benevolence, justice, and restraint. Excess, cruelty, or neglect of the people endangered the mandate. This moralization of politics distinguished Zhou ideology from earlier dynastic thought. It meant that rulers could not rely solely on lineage or ritual precision. They had to demonstrate virtue in governance. The mandate of heaven thus provided not only legitimacy, but also accountability. At the same time, the Zhou did not abandon divination. Tortoise shells and bones continued to be heated and cracked to reveal omens, though bronze inscriptions gradually became the dominant medium of recording. Kings and nobles sought guidance in matters of war, harvest, and ritual, but divination was increasingly framed within the larger doctrine of Tian's will. Omens were not arbitrary, but signs of heaven's judgment. Interpreting them required both ritual skill and moral reflection. Religion in the Zhou age also extended beyond the court. Common households maintained shrines to their ancestors, offered sacrifices on seasonal festivals, and participated in communal rites linked to agriculture. Planting and harvest were accompanied by prayers and offerings, ensuring fertility and prosperity. Local communities celebrated with music and dance, reinforcing bonds of solidarity. While less elaborate than the ceremonies of the aristocracy, these practices reflected the same underlying principles: reverence for ancestors, recognition of heaven's order, and the belief that harmony between human and divine ensured well-being. The integration of religion into daily life meant that every aspect of Zhou society was permeated with ritual meaning. Agriculture was not merely subsistence, but an offering to heaven and ancestors. Warfare was not merely conquest, but the fulfillment of cosmic justice. Governance was not merely administration, but the enactment of heaven's will. The Zhou worldview left a little separation between sacred and secular. To act in society was to participate in the cosmic order, and to neglect ritual was to risk disorder at every level. The lasting influence of Zhou religion can be seen in how later generations remembered it. Confucian thinkers revered the rituals of the Western Zhou as the model of harmony and virtue, contrasting them with the decline of later ages. They saw in Zhou ceremonies the embodiment of moral governance, where rulers cultivated themselves through ritual and music and thereby governed the people with benevolence. The concept of Tian became central to Chinese political philosophy, enduring as the standard by which dynasties justified their rise and explained their fall. Ancestor worship remained the foundation of Chinese family life for millennia, shaping both private devotion and public legitimacy. In the Western Zhou, these practices were not yet ideals of antiquity but living realities. The kings of Haojing stood at altars beneath the open sky, offering sacrifices to heaven and ancestors, surrounded by nobles, musicians, and ministers. Bronze vessels shone in the firelight, inscribed with prayers and proclamations. Music echoed through the courtyards, aligning human hearts with cosmic rhythms. Farmers worked the fields, knowing their grain would feed both families and ancestral spirits. Lords maintained temples that tied their domains to the royal house and to the mandate of heaven. This was the religious life of the Zhou, a world where lineage and cosmos intertwined, where Tian's favour was sought and sustained through constant ritual, and where the destiny of the dynasty depended on fidelity to both ancestors and heaven. The Zhou dynasty defined its authority not only through warfare and governance, but through the precise rhythms of ritual life at court. In the great halls of Haojing and Chengzhou, rulers and nobles enacted ceremonies that expressed their vision of order. These rituals were not secondary to politics. They were politics. They embodied the mandate of heaven, displayed the hierarchy of the feudal order, and trained the aristocracy in the virtues required for governance. Among them, music played a central role, transforming ritual into harmony made audible, reinforcing the belief that the well-governed state was one where sound, movement, and morality aligned. The Zhou rites became the codified pattern through which the dynasty articulated its ideals, creating a legacy that later thinkers would hold up as the pinnacle of civilization. Court ritual in the Western Zhou was expansive, covering occasions from enthronements and sacrifices to audiences and feasts. Each event followed strict rules of dress, movement, and speech. Participants stood, bowed, or spoke according to rank. The king presided at the centre, facing south, embodying his position as mediator between heaven and the human realm. Around him, nobles, ministers, and envoys stood in ordered ranks. Every gesture reinforced hierarchy, reminding all that authority flowed from the Son of Heaven outward through the feudal network. These ceremonies could last hours or even days, marked by offerings, music, and banquets. To attend was to reaffirm loyalty. To participate was to recognize one's place in the cosmic and political order. Sacrifices formed the core of many court rituals. Altars were set for heaven, earth, and the royal ancestors, and offerings of grain, wine, and animals were prepared. The king or his appointed ministers presented these offerings with solemn words, often recorded on bronze vessels that preserved the memory of the event. The act of sacrifice was not simply a gift to the spirits, but a communication, renewing the bond between the dynasty and the forces that sustained it. Successful harvests, victories in war, or stability in the realm were attributed to the efficacy of these rites, while misfortunes were interpreted as signs of ritual failure or moral decline. The king's ability to perform rituals correctly was as crucial as his ability to lead armies, for in Zhou thought the two were inseparable. Feasts followed sacrifices, binding the aristocracy together through shared consumption. Bronze cauldrons and tripods held cooked meats and grains, bronze jugs poured wine, and nobles sat in ordered ranks while musicians performed. The vessels bore inscriptions that reminded diners of the king's favour, the ancestors' blessing, and the duty of loyalty. The feast was therefore both social and sacred. Eating together symbolised unity, while the inscriptions and rituals reminded all that their unity was rooted in heaven's mandate. The memory of these occasions lingered, reinforced each time a vessel was used in later sacrifices, or displayed in a noble's temple. Music was essential to these gatherings. Zhou music was highly structured, performed with bronze bells, stone chimes, drums, and flutes. Each instrument had its role. contributing to harmonies believed to reflect cosmic order. Performances followed sequences of tones associated with the balance of yin and yang, the cycles of seasons, and the movements of celestial bodies. The belief that sound could shape character gave music a moral dimension. By listening and participating, nobles were trained to internalize harmony, restraint, and discipline. Music was not for pleasure alone, but for cultivation of virtue, preparing the aristocracy to govern with moderation and justice. Dance-accompanied music, performed by lines of men and women in carefully choreographed movements. These dances symbolized order and balance, mirroring the rhythms of the cosmos. Some depicted martial themes, with dancers holding weapons in patterns that evoked chariot formations or hunting scenes. Others depicted agricultural cycles, celebrating planting and harvest. In all cases, the dances reinforced the connection between human society and natural rhythms. To watch or perform was to participate in the enactment of cosmic harmony, an experience that shaped the values of those present. The Zhou rites, later codified in texts such as the Book of Rites, emerged from these court practices. They set out detailed instructions for ceremonies of every kind: royal sacrifices, noble weddings, funerals, investitures, audiences, and seasonal observances. The rites covered not only what was to be done, but how it was to be done, the number of steps, the orientation of altars, the sequence of bows, the pitch of tones. Precision was paramount, for the efficacy of ritual depended on flawless performance. These prescriptions reflected the Zhou conviction that human order must mirror cosmic order, that to deviate in ceremony was to risk disrupting harmony. The codification of the rites also served to unify the realm. By prescribing uniform practices, the Zhou ensured that nobles across distant fiefs enacted ceremonies in the same pattern, binding them into a shared culture. Even as vassals governed semi-autonomously, their participation in Zhou ritual life marked them as part of the same civilization. The rites thus extended royal authority beyond the walls of Haojing, projecting it into every temple where nobles performed sacrifices with vessels bearing the royal seal. The spread of ritual was as important as the spread of military control in maintaining Zhou unity. Ritual also functioned as a system of education. Young nobles trained in music, dance, archery, and chariotry as part of their formation. These arts were not skills for battle or entertainment alone, but forms of moral cultivation. Archery trained focus and discipline, chariotry required coordination and hierarchy, music cultivated harmony, and ritual taught reverence. Together they formed the curriculum through which the Zhou aristocracy prepared to govern. The rites thus embedded education in culture, ensuring that each new generation absorbed the values of restraint, loyalty, and respect for order. The role of ritual specialists at court was critical. Musicians, dancers, diviners, and scribes formed a professional class that preserved the knowledge of ceremonies. Their presence ensured continuity across generations, transmitting patterns of ritual with accuracy. Ministers of ritual held high office, advising kings on correct procedures and interpreting omens. Their influence was considerable, for they guided the king in matters where political and cosmic order intersected. Inscriptions and texts preserve their admonitions, reminding rulers to govern with virtue lest heaven withdraw its mandate. Court rituals extended beyond sacrifice and feast into the everyday conduct of governance. Audiences with envoys, announcements of decrees, and receptions of tribute were all framed within ritual. The layout of the court, the order of speaking, and the exchange of gifts followed prescribed patterns. Even legal proceedings were conducted as rituals, with oaths sworn before ancestors and penalties justified as restorations of balance. This ritualization of governance ensured that every act of authority was embedded in a moral and cosmic framework. To rule was to perform correctly. To govern was to align action with the rites. The significance of the Zhou rites was remembered long after the dynasty itself declined. Later Confucian thinkers idealized the Western Zhou as the age when ritual and music achieved perfect harmony. They saw in the Zhou court the model of how governance should be conducted, where rulers cultivated themselves through ritual and ruled with benevolence, and where nobles internalized virtue through music and ceremony. The rites became the foundation of Confucian philosophy, shaping Chinese political and social thought for millennia. Even when circumstances changed, the memory of Zhou ritual remained a standard against which later ages were measured. Within the Western Zhou itself, the rites provided cohesion during a time of expansion and challenge. As the dynasty extended its reach over diverse peoples, ritual created a common culture. As lords grew powerful in their domains, ritual reminded them of their place in the hierarchy. As kings sought to maintain heaven's mandate, ritual affirmed their legitimacy. The court of Haojing was therefore not merely a political centre, but a sacred theatre where the drama of cosmic order was enacted daily, binding the dynasty together through sound, movement and ceremony. From the clang of bronze bells to the solemn offerings at ancestral temples, from the feasts that bound nobles in loyalty to the inscriptions that preserved memory, the Zhou rites shaped the life of the dynasty at every level. They transformed governance into performance, morality into sound, and hierarchy into visible order. The Western Zhou kings stood at the centre of this world, not only as rulers but as ritual masters, their authority legitimized and sustained by the ceaseless rhythm of ceremonies that aligned human society with heaven. The Western Zhou dynasty, for all its grandeur in ritual and its careful balance of feudal obligations, was not immune to the forces of decline. The very structures that had once secured its authority, kinship-based enfeoffments, reliance on vassal loyalty, and the integration of conquered peoples, contained vulnerabilities that grew more dangerous as generations passed. By the middle of the 8th century BCE, the stability that had characterized the dynasty's early centuries began to unravel. Local lords grew powerful, the royal court struggled to assert control, and external pressures from nomadic groups pressed against the dynasty's borders. These strains culminated in a dramatic collapse that forced the Zhou to abandon their western capital of Haojing and re-establish themselves further east at Luoyang. This shift marked not only a change of geography, but a profound transformation in the character of the dynasty. The decline of Western Zhou authority began with the weakening of royal power relative to the feudal lords. In the first generations after King Wu and the Duke of Zhou, kinship ties bound the aristocracy to the royal house with living memory of shared conquest and the mandate of heaven. Over time, however, the bonds of blood diluted. Vassal domains passed down through generations became entrenched powers in their own right. Local lords commanded armies, managed economies, and maintained their own ancestral cults. While they continued to acknowledge the Zhou king's authority, in practice they operated with increasing independence. Tribute became irregular, military support less reliable, and loyalty less assured. The king remained the son of heaven in theory, but in practice his authority was often symbolic outside the Wei River Valley. At the same time, the Zhou kings faced growing challenges from external groups. To the north and west, nomadic peoples pressed against the borders, attracted by the wealth of the Zhou heartland. These groups, mounted on horses and skilled in raiding, threatened the agricultural settlements and trade routes that sustained the dynasty. To the south, other tribes resisted incorporation, conducting periodic uprisings that required costly campaigns to suppress. The Zhou kings, once formidable commanders, now found their military resources strained, for the feudal lords were increasingly reluctant to mobilize in support of the royal court. The mandate of heaven, which once seemed secure, now appeared in jeopardy, for repeated defeats or disasters were interpreted as signs of divine disfavor. The internal weakness of the dynasty became starkly clear during the reign of King Yu in the late 8th century BCE. King Yu is remembered in the chronicles as a ruler whose personal decisions accelerated the collapse of Western Zhou. He elevated his favoured consort, Bao Si, and sought to replace the crown prince, leading to deep divisions within the court and the alienation of powerful nobles. The story, remembered with a mixture of scandal and moral judgment, tells that King Yu, eager to amuse Baosi, lit the warning beacons of Hao Jing to summon his vassals, only to watch her laugh at the sight of their fruitless rush to defend the capital. When a real invasion later came, the lords were less willing to respond, believing the king had trivialized the system. Whether or not every detail of this tale is literal, it reflects the perception that the authority of the king had degenerated into frivolity and mismanagement. The crisis reached its peak in 771 BCE, when the Quanrong, a nomadic group from the west, launched a major attack. Allied with disaffected nobles who opposed King Yu, they struck Haojing with devastating force. The capital was sacked, palaces burned, and King Yu was killed. The royal ancestral temples, the very heart of Zhou ritual and legitimacy, were desecrated. The fall of Haojing was more than the destruction of a city. It was the collapse of the order that the Western Zhou had carefully constructed for centuries. The mandate of heaven, once proclaimed with bronze inscriptions and ritual music, now seemed to have abandoned the royal house. In the aftermath, surviving members of the royal family and loyal nobles regrouped. They placed King Ping, the son of King Yu, on the throne, but the devastation of Haojing made it impossible to continue ruling from the old western capital. The dynasty faced a choice: attempt to rebuild in the exposed Wei Valley, vulnerable to further attacks, or relocate to a safer position. The decision was made to move eastward, to Luoyang in the Central Plains. This relocation, though preserving the Zhou Dynasty in name, marked the end of the Western Zhou and the beginning of what historians call the Eastern Zhou. The move east had profound consequences. Haojing had been the ritual and cultural heart of the dynasty, deeply tied to the Zhou's ancestral lands and traditions. Its fall severed the dynasty from its origins, forcing it to adapt to a new environment. Luoyang, though strategically placed at the crossroads of the Central Plains, lacked the same connection to the ancestral temples of the West. The relocation symbolized the weakening of royal power, for the king had been driven from his home and forced to rely more heavily on the support of feudal lords. From this point onward, the Zhou kings retained the title of Son of Heaven but exercised little direct control over the realm. The feudal states, once bound by kinship and ritual, now acted with growing independence. The collapse of Western Zhou also transformed the meaning of the mandate of heaven. The fall of Haojing was interpreted as evidence that the royal house had lost heaven's favour through misrule. King Yu's failures were cited as examples of indulgence, corruption, and neglect of duty. The disasters that followed seemed to confirm that heaven had withdrawn its support. By relocating and continuing the dynasty, King Ping and his successors sought to reclaim legitimacy, but their weakened position made it clear that the mandate could no longer be maintained through royal authority alone. The narrative of dynastic decline, first articulated to explain the fall of the Shang, was now applied to the Zhou themselves. The aristocracy adapted to the new reality. Without the strong central authority of Haojing, regional lords increasingly pursued their own ambitions. They maintained the forms of ritual allegiance, continuing to acknowledge the Zhou king in ceremonies, but in practice they governed as independent rulers. Their courts grew in sophistication, their armies expanded, and their diplomacy extended beyond Zhou structures. The king, once the unchallenged centre of feudal order, became a figurehead, respected in title, but marginalised in power. This fragmentation set the stage for the centuries of political rivalry that defined the Eastern Zhou period. Yet even in decline, the Western Zhou left a powerful legacy. The memory of their rituals, music, and feudal order continued to shape Chinese thought. Confucius, centuries later, would look back on the Western Zhou as a golden age of harmony, where rulers governed with virtue and ceremonies aligned humanity with heaven. The collapse of Haojing thus became a moral lesson as well as a historical event, a reminder that even the most carefully constructed order could falter if rulers neglected their responsibilities. The move east to Luoyang preserved the dynasty in name, but the Western Zhou, with its strong kings, ritual grandeur and feudal cohesion, had come to an end. From this point onward, the Zhou kings presided over a different kind of realm, one where power lay increasingly in the hands of ambitious lords and new states. The relocation eastward was both survival and surrender, a compromise that allowed the dynasty to endure but at the cost of its former supremacy. The Western Zhou had collapsed, but the story of the Zhou dynasty was far from over. The centuries that followed would see new challenges, new philosophies, and new transformations as the legacy of Heaven's mandate continued to shape the destiny of China. The Zhou kings who re-established themselves at Luoyang after the fall of Haojing inherited little more than a fragile title and the remnants of ritual authority. The dynasty had been gravely weakened, its western homeland lost, its palaces and ancestral temples burned, and its prestige tarnished by defeat. Yet the Zhou name still carried weight, for the idea of the mandate of heaven had become deeply ingrained in the political imagination of the age. The Zhou kings could no longer dominate their realm as their ancestors once had, but they remained indispensable as symbols of legitimacy. This delicate balance of weakness and survival defined the Eastern Zhou, where the dynasty endured not by commanding armies, but by serving as the arbiter of tradition in an age of growing regional autonomy. Luoyang, the new capital, occupied a different landscape from Haojing. It lay further east, in the central plains, closer to the great feudal states that now held the real power of the realm. The city was not as defensible as the western capital, lacking the protective mountains and fertile Wei Valley that had nourished the dynasty's beginnings. Instead, it sat at the crossroads of major routes, accessible to surrounding powers. This position reflected the dynasty's new reality. The Zhou king could not isolate himself in a secure heartland, but had to remain at the centre of feudal politics, relying on the support of lords whose strength now surpassed his own. The move to Luoyang was thus both a retreat and an adaptation, a recognition that survival required proximity to those who had once been subordinates, but were now near equals. The early Eastern Zhou kings struggled to assert even minimal authority. King Ping, who led the move east, sought to stabilize the dynasty by reaffirming ritual legitimacy. He rebuilt ancestral temples, re-established sacrifices, and emphasized the continuity of the royal line despite the disasters of 771 BCE. By framing the relocation as a restoration rather than a defeat, he attempted to preserve the image of the Zhou as the chosen house of heaven. Yet his reliance on powerful lords to protect the dynasty revealed the limits of his position. Without their military support, the dynasty would have perished entirely. The arrangement was precarious, for it gave lords unprecedented influence in royal affairs. The feudal order, once structured around kinship and ritual obligations, now began to transform. Large states such as Jin, Qin, Chu, and Qi emerged as dominant powers, each commanding extensive lands, large populations, and formidable armies. These states continued to acknowledge the Zhou king in name, participating in rituals and receiving investiture titles, but in practice they pursued their own ambitions. The Zhou court at Luoyang became less a centre of power than a ceremonial stage where rival lords displayed their loyalty while simultaneously contesting supremacy. The authority of the Son of Heaven became symbolic, yet the symbol remained important, for to act without the king's sanction risked accusations of illegitimacy. Survival in this environment required the Zhou kings to adapt their role. No longer generals commanding decisive armies, they became custodians of tradition. Their value lay in their ability to confer legitimacy, to preside over sacrifices, and to serve as the neutral figure around whom feudal states could rally when seeking to present unity. The court continued to cast bronze vessels with inscriptions proclaiming heaven's mandate, but these proclamations now carried less practical force. Instead, they functioned as reminders of an ideal order, an ideal that lords could invoke but often ignored in their pursuit of power. Despite their weakness, the Zhou kings retained certain advantages. The prestige of their name, the continuity of their rituals, and the symbolic weight of their role as Son of Heaven gave them a unique position. Even the most powerful states hesitated to abolish the dynasty outright, for to do so would undermine the very concept of legitimacy on which they themselves relied. The Zhou kings thus survived by embodying an institution larger than their own armies. In a fragmented age, they represented continuity, the thread that tied new states back to the memory of a unified order. The relocation to Luoyang also reshaped the cultural geography of the dynasty. The city became a hub of ritual and intellectual life, where scholars, scribes, and ritual specialists gathered to preserve and transmit Zhou traditions. The memory of Western Zhou grandeur was recorded, codified, and idealized, forming the basis of texts that later philosophers would study. The decline of royal power paradoxically contributed to the preservation of Zhou culture, for the court, lacking military dominance, emphasized ritual, music, and learning as its enduring legacies. In this sense, the Eastern Zhou was not merely a story of decline, but also of cultural survival. The early centuries of the Eastern Zhou are remembered as the spring and autumn period, named after chronicles that recorded the events of various states. In this era, the Zhou king continued to perform ceremonies at Luoyang, receiving tribute and presiding over rituals, but the real drama unfolded in the courts of the feudal states. There, ambitious lords vied for hegemony, each seeking to expand influence while maintaining a facade of loyalty to the royal house. The king often served as a figure to whom disputes were formally referred, though in practice he lacked the power to enforce decisions. Yet the very fact that lords invoked his name demonstrated the continued significance of Zhou legitimacy. Reorganization in the Eastern Zhou was therefore not a central initiative imposed by kings, but a gradual adaptation by lords and ministers across the realm. Political authority shifted from kinship to territorial control, from ritual bonds to military strength. States developed administrative systems, codified laws, and standing armies, innovations that contrasted sharply with the feudal kinship structures of the Western Zhou. The Zhou king, while no longer central to these changes, remained the nominal head of the system, his presence legitimizing the new order, even as it evolved beyond his control. Survival for the Zhou dynasty meant accepting a diminished role. The kings no longer commanded the loyalty of all lords, but they retained a seat at the table of power by embodying the memory of heaven's mandate. Their court at Luoyang, though modest compared to the splendor of Haojing, remained a place where lords sent envoys, where rituals were performed, and where the idea of Zhou unity lingered. This survival was not glorious, but it was durable. The Zhou dynasty continued for centuries after its practical power had faded, a testament to the enduring strength of its cultural and ideological foundations. The contrast between Western and Eastern Zhou illustrates the dual nature of dynastic legitimacy. In the West, kings had embodied both ritual authority and military supremacy, uniting the realm through conquest and ceremony. In the East, stripped of military might, they relied on ritual alone, preserving their role by embodying ideals even as reality diverged. This transformation ensured that the dynasty endured long after its practical power was gone, shaping Chinese history not through domination, but through memory and continuity. From Luoyang, the Zhou kings watched as their vassals became rulers in their own right, as states like Jin and Chu rose to prominence, and as the balance of power shifted away from the royal court. Yet the kings remained, their survival ensuring that the concept of heaven's mandate and the memory of Zhou order were never entirely lost. The Eastern Zhou was thus a story of adaptation, of survival through redefinition, of a dynasty that endured not by force of arms but by force of tradition. The centuries that followed the Zhou relocation to Luoyang unfolded in an age of fragmentation and rivalry, later remembered as the Spring and Autumn period. The Zhou kings remained in their eastern capital, continuing to preside over rituals and ceremonies, but their practical authority had dwindled. The power of the realm now lay in the hands of ambitious lords who commanded armies, managed territories, and pursued their own strategies of survival and expansion. Though they still acknowledged the Son of Heaven in name, in reality they ruled as independent princes. The structure of feudal kinship that had once held the Western Zhou together had eroded, replaced by a system in which military might and political cunning determined dominance. Yet the Zhou name still carried prestige, and the competing lords often framed their ambitions in relation to it, invoking the king's legitimacy even as they disregarded his commands. The spring and autumn period, stretching from the 8th to the 5th century BCE, took its name from the annals kept by the state of Lu, a chronicle that recorded year by year the events of battles, alliances, successions, and rituals. The annals themselves were terse, but later readers filled them with meaning, interpreting the rise and fall of states as lessons in morality and politics. What emerges from this age is a portrait of constant flux, where no single state dominated for long, and where the balance of power shifted through warfare, diplomacy, and shifting alliances. At the heart of this competition was the idea of the hegemon, a title not formally sanctioned by Zhou kings, but recognised in practice by peers who acknowledged the leadership of the most powerful lords. The first among these to rise was Duke Huan of Qi in the 7th century BCE. Ruling a state on the Shandong Peninsula, he built Qi into a formidable power through reforms, alliances, and military campaigns. With the counsel of his minister Guanzhong, he strengthened administration, encouraged trade and industry, and disciplined his armies. His leadership extended beyond Qi, for he summoned other lords to alliances ostensibly formed to protect the Zhou king and repel external threats. Though the Zhou king played little role in these gatherings, the lords presented their cooperation as acts of loyalty to the royal house, a way of masking their independence under the cloak of tradition. Duke Huan's position as hegemon was thus framed as service to the Zhou, but in reality it represented the emergence of regional supremacy. Other states followed suit. The state of Jin in the north grew into a major power, often rivaling Qi. Its aristocracy commanded vast resources, and through both military campaigns and diplomatic maneuvers, Jin asserted dominance over neighbouring territories. The state of Chu in the south likewise expanded, incorporating diverse peoples into a powerful domain that challenged the traditional Zhou heartland. Chu's rise was significant, for it represented the growing importance of regions once seen as peripheral. No longer merely frontier tribes, the southern peoples under Chu became central actors in the political drama of the age. Their culture, distinct yet increasingly integrated into the Zhou world, demonstrated the expanding horizons of Chinese civilization. The idea of hegemony reflected the new political reality. With the Zhou king reduced to a figurehead, the states required a mechanism to coordinate action against external threats and internal disorder. The hegemon filled this role, summoning lords to conferences, organising joint campaigns and mediating disputes. Yet hegemony was always precarious. A hegemon depended on personal strength, capable ministers, and military success. When these faltered, rivals emerged to challenge supremacy. Thus, the spring and autumn period was marked by cycles of dominance and decline, with Qi, Jin, Chu, and later Wu and Yue, each enjoying moments of ascendancy. Warfare became more frequent and more complex in this period. The aristocratic chariot armies of the Western Zhou remained, but infantry forces expanded, drawn from the common population. Battles were often indecisive, with victories shifting from one side to another, but their frequency drained resources and reshaped societies. States that could mobilize larger armies and supply them effectively gained advantage, leading to administrative reforms that weakened the old aristocratic order. Ministers and officials rose in importance as rulers sought to manage the logistics of war and diplomacy. The growth of bureaucracy and merit-based appointments foreshadowed the transformations of the later Warring States period. Despite the prevalence of war, diplomacy was equally important. States formed alliances, sworn with oaths before ancestors and heaven, often at conferences where lords gathered to negotiate. These alliances were fluid. breaking and reforming as circumstances changed. Oaths were sealed with sacrifices and rituals, underscoring the continued role of religion even in a time of political fragmentation. Yet the frequent betrayal of alliances also revealed the erosion of trust in the feudal order. Ritual language persisted, but practical calculations increasingly dictated action. The Zhou kings at Luoyang remained present in name throughout these shifts. They continued to preside over sacrifices and issue investiture titles, and their court remained a ceremonial centre. But they lacked the means to enforce decisions or to mediate conflicts effectively. The hegemons occasionally invoked the need to defend the royal house, framing their actions as protection of Zhou legitimacy. But this was often little more than a rhetorical justification for their own ambitions. The king's role had become symbolic, a reminder of tradition rather than a source of power. Yet even this symbolism mattered, for the persistence of the Zhou line provided a thread of continuity that bound the age together. The spring and autumn period was also an age of cultural and intellectual ferment. The weakening of central authority and the competition among states created an environment in which new ideas circulated. Ministers and thinkers moved between courts, offering counsel on governance, war, and diplomacy. Traditions of ritual and music persisted, but they were now questioned, adapted, and reinterpreted in light of changing realities. The memory of Western Zhou harmony lingered as an ideal, but the practical concerns of survival demanded innovation. Out of this tension emerged the intellectual currents that would later coalesce into the 100 schools of thought. The chronicles of the spring and autumn period preserve not only the record of battles and alliances, but also the memory of moral judgments. Later interpreters, especially Confucian scholars, read the terse entries of the annals as commentaries on virtue and vice, praising rulers who acted with restraint and condemning those who pursued reckless ambition. The age became a vast lesson in the consequences of moral failure and the fragility of political order. The fall of one hegemon after another demonstrated that power without virtue was unstable, while the persistence of the Zhou king, however weakened, reminded readers that legitimacy required continuity with tradition. The role of the hegemon highlighted the transformation of Zhou political culture. In the Western Zhou, the king had embodied both ritual and military authority. In the Eastern Zhou, the king embodied ritual alone, while the hegemon embodied military and political power. The split between symbolic authority and practical control created a dual system in which legitimacy and power no longer resided in the same figure. This duality defined the age, producing both instability and creativity. States could not ignore the king, for his name was tied to heaven's mandate, but they no longer depended on him for leadership. Instead, they turned to hegemons, whose authority rose and fell with circumstance. The period's end did not bring resolution but transition. As the 5th century BCE approached, the power of the hegemon weakened, and the states themselves grew stronger and more centralized. The aristocratic order of the spring and autumn era gave way to the bureaucratic and militarized states of the Warring States period. Yet the memory of the spring and autumn age persisted, recorded in chronicles, shaped by Confucian interpretation, and remembered as a time when the ideals of Zhou order still lingered, even as they were transformed by the realities of rivalry and ambition. From Luoyang, the Zhou kings watched the shifting tides of power, their court surviving as a remnant of an earlier age. The hegemons rose and fell, states clashed and allied, and the political map of China changed constantly. Yet the dynasty endured, not through strength of arms, but through the resilience of tradition. The spring and autumn period thus stands as a chapter of survival through adaptation, where Zhou authority persisted as symbol, while real power migrated to the lords, and where the balance of heaven's mandate was contested not by one dynasty and its challengers, but by a multitude of states vying for supremacy under the shadow of a fading royal house. The spring and autumn world was shaped as much by conflict as by ceremony. The feudal lords who inherited the framework of the Zhou order found themselves compelled to navigate an environment where alliances shifted, rivalries deepened, and survival depended on both martial strength and diplomatic skill. The Zhou king, still present in Luoyang, provided a symbolic anchor, but the realities of power lay in the hands of those who could field armies, negotiate alliances, and impose their will upon their neighbours. The struggles of these lords defined the period, producing a landscape of incessant warfare and ceaseless manoeuvring that gradually transformed the political and social fabric of China. Warfare in this era retained elements of the aristocratic traditions of the Western Zhou, but it also began to evolve into something more complex. Chariot warfare, with nobles commanding teams of horses and small retinues of warriors, remained a hallmark of aristocratic prestige. Battles often opened with ritualized displays, challenges, and single combats between champions, reflecting the values of honour and lineage that still shaped aristocratic culture. Yet as conflicts multiplied, practical needs pushed states to expand their forces beyond the noble class. Infantry levies of commoners became increasingly important, and battles grew larger and more decisive. The introduction of iron technology in the later centuries further accelerated this transformation, allowing for the equipping of larger numbers of soldiers. The logistics of war placed heavy demands on states. Armies required food, weapons, and coordination across long distances. Lords who could organise supply lines, construct roads, and manage resources gained advantages over rivals who relied solely on traditional kinship mobilization. Ministers and advisors specializing in administration became indispensable, gradually reducing the dominance of hereditary nobles. This shift sowed the seeds for the eventual rise of professional bureaucracies in the Warring States period, but its beginnings can be traced to the struggles of the spring and autumn lords who needed to sustain campaigns year after year. Diplomacy became as vital as war. States sought to balance against one another by forming leagues and alliances, often sworn with oaths before heaven and ancestors. These gatherings brought lords together in ritual settings where sacrifices sealed promises of mutual defence or non-aggression. The hegemon, when strong, presided over such conferences, projecting authority by rallying other lords under his leadership. Yet the fragility of these alliances was constant. Oaths were broken as soon as interests shifted, and states that once fought side by side could quickly become enemies. The ritual framework of diplomacy preserved the appearance of Zhou unity, but the reality was one of constant recalibration and mistrust. The chronicles of the time record endless sequences of campaigns, raids, and betrayals. One year a lord would march to support the Zhou king against external raiders, the next he would turn his army against a neighbour. Victories brought prestige and territory, but defeats could be catastrophic, leading to loss of land, prestige, and sometimes the annihilation of entire lineages. States rose and fell with remarkable speed. Some, like Jin and Chu, built enduring power, while others disappeared entirely, absorbed by stronger neighbours. The map of China during this period was in constant flux, a mosaic of shifting borders and contested frontiers. The struggles of the lords were not only external, but also internal. Within each state, rulers had to manage the ambitions of their own nobles and ministers. Aristocratic families that had once shared power in collective councils often resisted the centralization of authority by rulers seeking to strengthen their domains. In states like Jin, internal factionalism among powerful clans frequently erupted into conflict, weakening the state even as it pursued external wars. The need to balance aristocratic privilege with the demands of military efficiency created constant tension, shaping the evolution of political institutions. Warfare also reshaped society. As infantry levies became more important, commoners gained new roles in the defence of their states. Though they did not yet hold political power, their participation in war began to erode the absolute dominance of the aristocracy. The increasing scale of armies required broader mobilization, pulling entire communities into the cycle of conflict. Farmers supplied grain, artisans forged weapons, and villages sent sons to serve in campaigns. The burdens of war were heavy, but they also created a sense of shared identity within states, strengthening loyalty to rulers who could protect and provide. Diplomacy, meanwhile, cultivated a new class of specialists. Envoys, scribes, and advisors travelled between courts, carrying messages, negotiating treaties, and shaping strategy. The ability to persuade, to interpret omens, and to manipulate ritual language became powerful tools. Some of these figures gained reputations that extended beyond their home states, moving from court to court as wandering counsellors. Their presence reflected the growing complexity of interstate relations and foreshadowed the rise of itinerant philosophers and strategists in the later Warring States period. The struggles of the lords also redefined the role of the Zhou king. Though stripped of military authority, the king remained the nominal head of the feudal system. Conferences and treaties were often justified as acts of loyalty to the royal house, and lords continued to receive investiture from Luoyang. In practice, however, the king was powerless to prevent their conflicts. His role was reduced to that of a ritual figure, invoked to sanctify actions but unable to dictate outcomes. Yet this symbolic function mattered deeply, for it preserved the illusion of continuity. Without the Zhou king, the entire framework of Heaven's mandate might have collapsed. The lords competed for power, but they still operated within the ideological order that the Zhou had established. The combination of incessant warfare and fragile diplomacy produced an age of both instability and innovation. States experimented with new forms of governance, military organisation, and economic management. Success favoured those who adapted, while stagnation invited conquest. Over time, the feudal kinship order gave way to territorial states defined less by lineage and more by control of land and resources. This transformation was not sudden but gradual, driven by the pressures of conflict and the necessities of survival. The legacy of the spring and autumn struggles was twofold. On one hand, it eroded the authority of the Zhou king and dismantled the feudal order of the Western Zhou. On the other, it laid the groundwork for the emergence of powerful states that would dominate the Warring States period. The experiences of constant war and shifting diplomacy forced rulers to rethink governance, to expand administration, and to cultivate talent beyond hereditary aristocracy. Out of the struggles of this age came the conditions that produced the great transformations of later centuries. Through all of this, the Zhou Dynasty endured in name, its kings presiding from Luoyang as the lords fought, allied, and betrayed each other. The dynasty's survival, despite its impotence, testified to the enduring strength of the idea of Heaven's mandate and the cultural memory of Zhou order. The lords struggled for supremacy, but none dared claim the title of Son of Heaven outright, for to do so would be to abandon the framework that gave their power legitimacy. In this paradox, the dynasty survived even as it lost control, its kings overshadowed by the lords whose struggles defined the age. As the spring and autumn world matured, the fabric of the Zhou order stretched further and further from its original design. What had once been a tightly bound feudal system, centred on kinship and ritual, had become a landscape of independent states, each pursuing its own survival and expansion with little regard for the king in Luoyang. The rise of new powers across the realm reflected both the decline of royal authority and the transformation of society itself. States that had once been small or peripheral grew into formidable contenders, while the Zhou kings clung to ceremony as their last source of influence. The mandate of heaven, once embodied in the person of the king, now seemed to hover ambiguously over the entire realm, awaiting the ruler strong enough to claim it. The emergence of new states was tied to both geography and innovation. In the north and west, states like Jin and Qin consolidated vast territories. Jin, benefiting from fertile lands and a strong aristocracy, expanded into surrounding areas, often at the expense of weaker neighbours. Qin, once seen as a marginal frontier state, began to grow steadily in power, its rulers cultivating resilience in the rugged lands of the Upper Wei River. To the east, Qi flourished under strong leadership and reforms, while in the south, Chu expanded across wide and diverse territories, incorporating peoples once regarded as outside the Zhou cultural sphere. Even further south, the states of Wu and Yue rose to prominence, demonstrating how the political centre of gravity was shifting away from the old Zhou heartlands. This diversification of power reflected the waning ability of the Zhou king to serve as the central axis of authority. Where once the king had commanded armies and presided over decisive rituals that bound the lords together, he now stood largely as a symbolic figure. The court at Luoyang retained its ancestral temples and continued its ceremonies, but the resources to enforce royal will no longer existed. The lords still acknowledged the Son of Heaven in name, attending ceremonies and accepting investiture titles, but their obedience was more form than substance. They governed as sovereigns in their own right, managing their economies, directing their armies, and conducting diplomacy independently. The chronicles of the time record repeated instances in which lords acted without reference to the king, forging alliances, declaring wars, or shifting borders with little concern for Luoyang. When the king attempted to intervene, his voice carried little weight, for he lacked the military strength to enforce decisions. At best, he could serve as a mediator, but even then his authority depended on the willingness of stronger states to listen. More often, the king was reduced to a passive role, watching as the balance of power shifted among his former vassals. The title of Son of Heaven still commanded respect, but the reality of kingship had become hollow. The rise of new states was accompanied by profound internal changes. The old feudal order of hereditary lords ruling through kinship ties proved increasingly inadequate to manage expanding territories and populations. Rulers began to rely more on appointed officials chosen for ability rather than birth. These ministers oversaw taxation, military organisation, and legal affairs, laying the foundations for centralised administration. The struggles of the spring and autumn period had shown that survival required more than aristocratic valour. It required careful planning, efficient governance, and the ability to mobilise resources on a large scale. States that adapted to this reality prospered, while those that clung to older patterns fell behind. Chu provides a striking example of this transformation. Originally viewed by the Zhou as a semi-barbarian polity on the southern frontier, Chu grew into one of the most powerful states of the period. Its rulers adopted Zhou rituals and titles, presenting themselves as part of the broader cultural order, while simultaneously expanding aggressively into surrounding regions. Chu's incorporation of diverse peoples gave it immense resources, and its rulers developed elaborate courts that rivaled those of the traditional Zhou heartlands. The state's success challenged the assumption that legitimacy was confined to the northern plains, signalling that power could emerge from the peripheries and redefine the political landscape. Similarly, Wu and Yegium, once considered distant and marginal, rose to prominence through military strength and maritime power. Their rivalry culminated in dramatic conflicts in the 5th century BCE, demonstrating that the political arena now extended far beyond the immediate orbit of Luoyang. These southern states integrated local traditions with Zhou forms, creating hybrid cultures that enriched the diversity of the age. Their prominence further highlighted the decline of royal authority, for the Zhou king had little influence over these distant powers beyond the occasional ceremonial acknowledgement. The waning of Zhou authority was also reflected in the erosion of ritual as a binding force. While lords continued to perform sacrifices and participate in ceremonies, the uniformity of ritual practice began to break down. States developed their own traditions, emphasizing local deities and ancestral cults. The Zhou rites, once the common framework of unity, became ideals rather than realities. The memory of Western Zhou harmony lingered, but in practice the realm was increasingly fragmented. The king could no longer serve as the guarantor of ritual order, and the lords, though still invoking heaven's mandate, interpreted it in ways that suited their ambitions. The ideological consequences of this fragmentation were profound. The mandate of heaven, once clearly vested in the Zhou royal house, now seemed transferable. If the Zhou king could lose heaven's favour, then perhaps another ruler could claim it by demonstrating virtue and strength. This idea, first articulated to justify the Zhou conquest of the Shang, now worked against the Zhou themselves. Ambitious lords began to present their victories and reforms as signs of heaven's approval, even if they stopped short of claiming the title of Son of Heaven outright. The possibility of dynastic change hovered over the age, even as the Zhou kings clung to their ceremonial role. The decline of Zhou power did not mean the end of Zhou influence. The cultural legacy of the dynasty remained strong. The Zhou system of rites, music, and ritual language continued to shape political discourse. Even as states grew independent, they framed their actions in Zhou terms, using the language of virtue, loyalty, and heaven's mandate. The memory of the dynasty's early greatness provided a standard against which rulers measured themselves. Confucian thinkers later idealized this memory, portraying the Western Zhou as a golden age of order and morality. The very contrast between the past and the present reinforced the perception of decline, but it also ensured that the Zhou legacy endured. By the late spring and autumn period, the Zhou kings were little more than spectators to the struggles of their former vassals. Yet their survival, fragile as it was, continued to matter. As long as the dynasty endured, the framework of legitimacy remained intact. The kings presided over ceremonies, issued titles, and received envoys, preserving the illusion of unity. Without them, the system might have collapsed entirely into chaos. The endurance of the Zhou name, even as its authority waned, demonstrates the power of tradition and the resilience of ideas in sustaining political order. The rise of new states and the weakening of the Zhou kingship set the stage for the next great transformation of Chinese history. The old feudal order had dissolved, replaced by a multipolar world of ambitious states. The king had lost his power, but the idea of heaven's mandate remained, waiting to be claimed by a ruler strong enough to reunite the realm. The spring and autumn age, with its endless wars and shifting alliances, was drawing toward its end, giving way to the even more intense rivalries of the warring states period. Yet the Zhou dynasty, diminished but unbroken, still stood at the centre as the shadow of legitimacy, a reminder of a once great order that had shaped the civilization now entering a new and turbulent phase. The disintegration of central Zhou authority and the rise of ambitious states created not only political upheaval, but also an environment of extraordinary intellectual creativity. As the feudal order eroded, rulers and ministers found themselves facing challenges for which the old traditions no longer provided clear answers. Warfare was constant, diplomacy was fragile, and society was shifting under the pressures of reform. Out of this turbulence rose a remarkable age of reflection and debate, later remembered as the time of the 100 schools of thought. Philosophers, teachers, and wandering scholars sought to understand the causes of disorder and to propose remedies that could restore harmony to the human realm. Their ideas shaped the course of Chinese civilization for centuries, and they emerged directly from the context of Zhou decline. Confucius, remembered as Kongzi, was one of the most influential figures of this period. Born in the state of Lu during the 6th century BCE, he lived in a world of political rivalry and moral uncertainty. His teachings drew deeply on the memory of the Western Zhou, which he revered as a golden age of ritual order and virtuous rulership. For Confucius, the chaos of his own time reflected a departure from the principles that had once governed society. He believed that the solution lay not in military conquest or legal coercion, but in the cultivation of virtue and the restoration of proper ritual. To him, the Zhou rites were not merely empty ceremonies, but the foundation of moral life, training individuals to act with reverence, respect, and harmony. Confucius emphasized the role of the ruler as a moral exemplar. A king or lord who cultivated virtue would inspire loyalty and harmony without the need for harsh punishments. Government, in his vision, was a matter of moral education rather than force. He urged rulers to practice benevolence, righteousness, and sincerity, for only then would heaven's mandate be secure. His teachings extended to all levels of society, for he believed that the cultivation of virtue began in the family. Filial piety, respect for elders, and loyalty to kin were the roots of social order. By extending these principles outward, from family to state, harmony could be restored. Though Confucius never held great power himself, his ideas spread among disciples who preserved his sayings and transmitted them in texts such as the Analects. His vision was one of continuity, a call to return to the ideals of the Western Zhou, yet it was also innovative, for he transformed the memory of Zhou ritual into a universal philosophy of moral cultivation. In doing so, he ensured that the legacy of the Zhou would endure long after the dynasty itself had faded, reinterpreted through the lens of Confucian thought. Alongside Confucius stood other thinkers, whose perspectives diverged sharply. Laozi, the figure associated with Daoism, offered a very different response to the turbulence of the age. Where Confucius emphasized ritual and moral duty, Laozi emphasized withdrawal and alignment with the Tao, the natural way of the universe. In the text attributed to him, the Tao Te Ching, he criticized the artificiality of human institutions, arguing that excessive laws, rituals, and ambitions led only to disorder. The true path to harmony, he taught, was to follow the spontaneous rhythms of nature, practicing humility, simplicity, and non-action. Laozi's vision challenged the foundations of Zhou political culture. Rather than restoring the old order, he suggested transcending it, allowing rulers to govern by doing less, intervening minimally, and letting people live in accordance with their own nature. His philosophy appealed to those who were weary of endless wars and rigid hierarchies, offering a more personal path to peace. While Confucius sought to preserve Zhou ideals, Laozi pointed toward alternatives beyond the Zhou framework altogether. The tension between these two perspectives, moral cultivation through ritual versus alignment with natural spontaneity, became one of the enduring dialogues of Chinese thought. The age of the 100 schools, however, was far broader than Confucius and Laozi. The pressures of the Eastern Zhou gave rise to a multitude of schools, each proposing different solutions to the problem of disorder. Mohism, founded by Mosi, emphasized universal love and impartial care. Mosi argued that conflicts arose because rulers and people favored their own families and interests over others. By practicing impartial concern, society could eliminate strife. He criticized the extravagance of ritual and music, arguing that they wasted resources needed for defense and welfare. His teachings appealed to those who sought practical reforms and equality, though they stood in stark contrast to Confucian reverence for ritual. Another current of thought, later known as legalism, took a more pragmatic and austere approach. Legalist thinkers argued that human beings were motivated primarily by self-interest, and that order could only be maintained through strict laws, clear rewards, and harsh punishments. They rejected the idea that moral cultivation alone could restore harmony. Instead, they urged rulers to strengthen the state through centralized administration, standardized laws, and disciplined armies. Legalism emerged from the brutal realities of interstate rivalry, providing the intellectual foundation for states that sought efficiency and power above all else. Its principles would eventually guide the rise of the Qin, the state that ended the Zhou Dynasty. Other schools flourished as well. The school of names engaged in logical debates about language and reality, questioning assumptions and refining reasoning. The yin-yang and five phases theorists sought to explain cosmic patterns, linking natural cycles to human affairs. Agriculturalists promoted egalitarian ideals, advocating for rulers to work the land alongside their subjects. Each of these schools reflected different aspects of the challenges facing Zhou society, from political rivalry to cosmic uncertainty. Together, they created a landscape of intellectual pluralism, unmatched in earlier Chinese history. What united these diverse schools was their shared concern with the problem of order. Each thinker, in his own way, grappled with the question of how to restore harmony in an age of decline, whether through virtue, withdrawal, impartial care, strict law, or cosmic balance. All sought answers to the same crisis. The collapse of Western Zhou authority had created a vacuum that demanded new solutions, and the philosophers of the age filled it with creativity and vision. The proliferation of ideas was facilitated by the mobility of scholars. Many were not tied to a single state, but travelled between courts, offering their counsel to rulers seeking advantage. Kings and lords, eager for strategies to strengthen their domains, patronised philosophers and debated their proposals. This circulation of ideas created a vibrant intellectual marketplace, where doctrines competed for influence and adapted to new contexts. Some rulers adopted Confucian advisors to cultivate legitimacy through moral governance, while others embraced legalist methods to tighten control. The diversity of practice mirrored the diversity of thought, and the competition among states ensured that no single school achieved complete dominance. The Zhou Dynasty, though politically weak, remained central to this intellectual ferment. The memory of its rituals, its doctrine of heaven's mandate, and its collapse provided the backdrop for philosophical reflection. Confucius invoked the Zhou rites as the model to emulate, while Mohists criticized them as wasteful. Daoists dismissed them as artificial, and legalists replaced them with law. Yet in every case, the Zhou legacy was the reference point. Even as the dynasty faded, its cultural influence permeated the debates that would shape Chinese civilization for millennia. The 100 schools of thought turned the Zhou age into one of the most formative periods in Chinese intellectual history. The contrast between Confucius and Laozi, between Mohists and legalists, reflected not only philosophical differences, but the lived realities of a world in turmoil. Each doctrine was an attempt to make sense of the collapse of order and to propose a path towards stability. In this way, the decline of the Zhou kingship paradoxically gave birth to one of the richest legacies of the dynasty. The philosophical traditions that continued to guide China long after the Zhou themselves had disappeared. As the Eastern Zhou advanced into its later phase, these ideas spread more widely, influencing rulers, ministers, and common people alike. The struggle for order had become not only a political contest, but an intellectual one, where the future of civilization itself was debated in the courts of lords and in the teachings of wandering sages. The dynasty survived as a shadow of its former self, but the ideas born in its decline ensured that its cultural impact would endure forever. As the Eastern Zhou advanced from the Spring and Autumn Age into the 4th century BCE, the fragmentation of authority deepened into a new and even more intense phase of rivalry, later known as the Warring States period. The Zhou kings remained in Luoyang, still conducting rituals and maintaining the outward forms of the mandate of heaven, but their role had shrunk to that of symbolic custodians. Real power belonged to a handful of large, ambitious states that no longer viewed themselves as vassals in a feudal order, but as sovereign powers in their own right. These states transformed the political and military landscape of China, abandoning the old aristocratic traditions in favour of new institutions, armies, and strategies that would ultimately pave the way for unification under a single empire. The very structure of war changed in this era. The chariot-based battles of the Western Zhou and early spring and autumn period gave way to mass infantry armies supported by cavalry. Chariots had once symbolised aristocratic prestige, their crews drawn from noble families who saw warfare as an extension of ritualised competition. By the Warring States age, however, they had become increasingly obsolete. The scale of warfare expanded dramatically, with armies numbering in the tens or even hundreds of thousands. To sustain such forces required innovations in recruitment, supply and training, leading rulers to draw upon the common population far more directly than before. Iron technology, spreading more widely in this period, facilitated the equipping of large armies. Iron ploughs increased agricultural productivity, allowing for greater surpluses to support soldiers. Iron weapons, spears, swords, and crossbows were cheaper to produce than bronze and could be distributed in vast numbers. The crossbow in particular became a decisive weapon, capable of piercing armour and requiring less training than the composite bow. Its adoption marked a turning point in military practice, levelling the battlefield between traditional aristocratic warriors and common infantry. War was no longer the exclusive domain of noble charioteers. It had become a contest of states mobilizing entire populations. The demands of these larger armies spurred administrative reforms. States developed bureaucracies to manage taxation, conscription, and logistics. Land was surveyed, households registered, and labour obligations standardized. Rulers appointed officials on the basis of merit and efficiency, rather than hereditary rank, creating professional administrations that could oversee increasingly complex societies. This shift undermined the old aristocracy, whose power had rested on kinship ties and hereditary privilege. In their place rose ministers, generals, and administrators whose authority came from appointment by the ruler. The centralization of power within states mirrored the centralization of military organization, as rulers sought to eliminate internal rivals in order to direct resources toward external competition. Diplomacy also took on new forms in this era. The proliferation of powerful states created a constantly shifting balance of power. Alliances were formed and broken with dizzying speed, as rulers sought to check rivals and expand their own influence. Envoys travelled between courts, negotiating treaties and proposing coalitions. The concept of vertical and horizontal alliances emerged, with some states advocating for unity against a common enemy, and others promoting alignment with stronger powers for protection. These diplomatic manoeuvres required skilled persuaders, giving rise to a class of itinerant lobbyists who offered their talents to whichever state would employ them. Their arguments, recorded in texts like the Strategies of the Warring States, reveal a world where cunning rhetoric and strategic calculation were as important as armies. The Zhou kings, though largely irrelevant to these manoeuvres, remained as nominal figures to whom some treaties and proclamations referred. Yet by this stage their authority was so diminished that even the rhetoric of loyalty to the Son of Heaven had grown hollow. States increasingly invoked Heaven's mandate in relation to themselves, claiming that their victories and reforms demonstrated divine favour. The Zhou line persisted, but its role in legitimizing power had been overtaken by the realities of conquest and administration. The mandate of heaven had become a principle waiting to be claimed by whoever could reunify the realm. The transformation of politics during the Warring States period was as profound as the transformation of war. Rulers consolidated authority by curtailing the power of hereditary aristocrats and elevating officials dependent on royal favour. Legalist thinkers provided the intellectual justification for this process, arguing that strong laws, uniform punishments, and centralized control were essential for survival. States such as Qin adopted legalist reforms with particular vigour, abolishing hereditary fiefs, standardizing laws, and enforcing strict accountability among officials. These measures created efficient and disciplined states capable of mobilizing resources on an unprecedented scale. Other states pursued different blends of philosophy and policy. Some rulers employed Confucian advisors to emphasize moral governance, using ritual and benevolence to cultivate loyalty. Others drew on Mahist principles of frugality and defense, focusing on fortifications and impartiality. The diversity of practice reflected the diversity of ideas circulating in the 100 schools of thought. Yet regardless of ideological orientation, all states shared the need to centralize, reform, and innovate in order to survive in the brutal environment of the warring states. The struggles among these states were relentless. Qin expanded from its base in the west, gradually transforming from a frontier power into a formidable contender. Chu dominated the south with its vast resources and diverse population. Qi in the East combined economic strength with strategic diplomacy. Han, Zhao, Wei, and Yan carved out spheres of influence, each maneuvering against the others in shifting coalitions. The constant wars reshaped the map of China, as weaker states were annexed and stronger ones consolidated. By the end of the period, only a handful of great powers remained, locked in a contest for ultimate supremacy. The social consequences of these changes were immense. The decline of the old aristocracy opened paths for talented commoners to rise through merit. Soldiers, officials, and scholars could achieve prominence through service to the state, rather than through hereditary privilege. This fluidity created opportunities, but also demanded loyalty to the centralized authority of rulers. Ordinary people were drawn more directly into the affairs of the state, through conscription, taxation, and labor obligations. The lives of farmers and artisans were shaped not only by local lords, but by distant administrations that demanded precise contributions to the machinery of war. Cities grew in size and importance as administrative centres, markets, and hubs of military supply. Trade expanded, facilitated by roads built for armies but used also by merchants. Iron production stimulated commerce, while agricultural surpluses supported growing populations. The scale of economic activity increased, reflecting the integration of regions into state-controlled systems. The Warring States period was thus not only an age of war, but also an age of economic and social transformation, laying the groundwork for the centralized empires that would follow. The constant conflict also spurred the development of strategic thought. The art of war, attributed to Sun Tzu, encapsulated the lessons of the age. It emphasized deception, flexibility, and the importance of intelligence over brute force. The text reflected the realities of large-scale, complex warfare, where victory depended not only on strength, but on cunning and adaptability. Strategic writings circulated among states, shaping the practices of generals and influencing military thought for centuries. Through all these transformations, the Zhou kings remained, their dynasty still in existence but reduced to little more than a relic. The persistence of their line, however, provided continuity amid the chaos. Even as states ignored their commands, the existence of a Zhou king reminded all that China remained within the framework of a single civilization. The eventual unification under Qin would be presented not as the creation of something new, but as the fulfillment of an order that the Zhou had once embodied. In this sense, the fading dynasty continued to shape the imagination of the age, even as it lost all practical relevance. The Warring States period was a crucible of transformation. War became larger, more brutal, and more decisive. Politics became centralized, efficient, and often ruthless. Philosophy flourished, offering diverse visions of order. Society shifted, breaking down old hierarchies and creating new opportunities. The Zhou dynasty, though powerless, remained a thread of continuity, its mandate of heaven concept reinterpreted and contested by the new powers rising around it. Out of this turbulent age emerged the foundations of imperial China, forged in the fires of rivalry and innovation that the decline of Zhou authority had unleashed. The intensifying struggles of the Warring States period did not produce chaos alone. They also generated systematic attempts to bring order through new forms of political philosophy, diplomatic manoeuvring, and ambitious projects of centralization. As the great powers competed for supremacy, rulers sought not only stronger armies but stronger states, and this required doctrines that justified and directed the concentration of authority. Among the most influential of these was legalism, a philosophy that emerged directly from the brutal conditions of the age. Alongside legalism, diplomacy continued to evolve, producing complex networks of alliances and rivalries that kept the balance of power in constant motion. Together, these forces shaped the quest for unification, as ambitious rulers sought to overcome fragmentation and claim the mandate of heaven for themselves. Legalism arose from the conviction that human beings, left to their own devices, were selfish, short-sighted, and prone to disorder. The traditions of the Western Zhou, with their emphasis on ritual and moral cultivation, seemed inadequate in an age where survival depended on decisive action. Legalist thinkers such as Shang in Qin, Shen Bahai, and Han Feizi argued that the key to order was not ritual or virtue, but law. Strong, clear, and uniformly enforced laws would compel obedience, eliminate ambiguity, and ensure that the state could mobilize its resources effectively. Rewards for service and punishments for failure created an incentive structure that left no room for personal favoritism or aristocratic privilege. In practice, legalist reforms meant the systematic centralization of power. Shang Yang, serving in Qin in the 4th century BCE, abolished hereditary fiefs, replacing them with administrative districts governed by appointed officials. Land was redistributed, and households were registered to create precise records for taxation and conscription. Military service became the path to advancement, allowing commoners to rise through merit while undermining the old aristocracy. Agriculture was encouraged through rewards, while idleness and luxury were punished. The goal was a disciplined, productive, and militarized society, one capable of sustaining large armies and decisive campaigns. These reforms were harsh, and they provoked resistance from entrenched elites, but they transformed Qin from a peripheral state into a formidable power. The legalist emphasis on law, order, and efficiency resonated with rulers who faced relentless competition. In a world where failure meant conquest or annihilation, pragmatism often outweighed tradition. While Confucian ideals of virtue and ritual continued to inspire some rulers, legalism provided the tools for survival in a ruthless environment. The tension between these philosophies defined the age, but it was legalism that proved most effective in building the centralized states that would eventually compete for unification. Diplomacy during the warring states was as complex as warfare. The proliferation of strong states created an ever-shifting balance of power, with coalitions forming and dissolving in rapid succession. Two main strategies dominated: vertical alliances and horizontal alliances. Vertical alliances sought to unite the weaker states against the strongest, creating a defensive bloc to resist conquest. Horizontal alliances, by contrast, sought alignment with the strongest state, trading submission for protection or advantage. These strategies reflected the realities of power politics, where survival depended on choosing allies wisely and shifting positions as circumstances changed. Envoys and persuaders became central figures in this diplomatic world. Known as lobbyists or travelling persuaders, they moved between courts, offering arguments, strategies, and promises. Their eloquence and cunning could sway rulers, forging alliances or undermining rivals. The texts that record their speeches reveal a world of sharp rhetoric, where appeals to morality, self-interest, and fear were combined in intricate strategies. Diplomacy was not conducted through treaties alone, but through persuasion, deception, and manipulation, as states sought advantage in a constantly shifting landscape. The Zhou king, still seated in Luoyang, played little role in these maneuvers. His court continued to perform rituals, but the great states rarely sought his approval. Instead, they acted as sovereign powers, invoking heaven's mandate in relation to their own successes. The king's existence preserved the appearance of continuity, but the substance of authority had shifted entirely to the competing states. The mandate of heaven had become a prize to be claimed through unification, and the states that sought it framed their ambitions as the fulfillment of Zhou ideals, even as they eclipsed the Zhou house itself. The quest for unification drove the evolution of both war and governance. States invested heavily in fortifications, constructing walls, moats, and strongholds to protect their territories. Armies grew larger, better equipped, and more professional. Generals adopted new tactics, making use of cavalry, crossbows, and complex formations. Victories were often decisive, leading to the annexation of conquered lands and the absorption of defeated populations. The map of China gradually simplified, as weaker states disappeared and stronger ones consolidated. By the 3rd century BCE, only a handful of great powers remained: Qin in the west, Chu in the south, Qi in the east, and the states of Zhou, Han, Wei, and Yan in the north and centre. The internal transformation of these states mirrored their external ambitions. Rulers strengthened their courts, appointing ministers who implemented reforms and supervised administration. Law codes were codified and standardized, ensuring consistency across expanding territories. Taxation was made more systematic, and agricultural output was carefully monitored. Population counts provided rulers with precise data for mobilization. These measures created states that were not merely collections of aristocratic fiefs, but centralized polities capable of direct control over their populations. The intellectual life of the age reflected these transformations. Philosophers and strategists continued to debate the best path to order, with Confucians urging virtue, Daoists advocating simplicity, Mohists promoting impartiality, and legalists insisting on strict law. The competition of ideas mirrored the competition of states, and rulers often drew selectively from multiple schools. Yet the trend towards centralization and discipline favoured legalist principles, particularly in states like Qin, which embraced them with uncompromising vigour. The quest for unification was not only political, but ideological. Each state that aspired to dominance framed its ambitions as the restoration of the order, the fulfillment of heaven's mandate, and the realization of Zhou ideals. Propaganda portrayed victories as evidence of divine favour, while reforms were justified as necessary for harmony. The memory of the Zhou Dynasty remained a powerful symbol, even as its kings faded into irrelevance. By invoking Zhou traditions, the rising states linked themselves to a broader cultural framework, ensuring that their ambitions were seen not as usurpations but as continuations of the civilizational project that Zhou had begun. The late Warring State period was marked by intensifying competition. Qin pressed its advantage through relentless campaigns, annexing neighbouring territories and reforming its administration to maximize efficiency. Chu, though vast, struggled to maintain cohesion across its diverse lands. Qi, once a leader, declined in relative power. The central states of Zhou, Han, and Wei contended fiercely with one another, exhausting their resources in constant rivalry. Yan, on the northern frontier, played a smaller role, but remained significant in the balance of power. The outcome of these struggles was uncertain, but the trend toward consolidation was unmistakable. Through all of this, the Zhou dynasty endured in name, its kings still performing rituals in Luoyang. Yet their role had become entirely symbolic, a faint echo of an order that had long since dissolved. The true story of the age was the transformation of war and politics, driven by legalist reforms, diplomatic manoeuvring, and the relentless pursuit of unification. The mandate of heaven, once the exclusive possession of the Zhou, had become the prize of conquest, awaiting the ruler strong enough to claim it and to impose order on a fragmented world. The Warring States period thus brought China to the threshold of empire. The innovations in governance, military organization, and philosophy forged in this crucible would endure long after the Zhou dynasty had vanished. The quest for unification, born of rivalry and sustained by ambition, would soon culminate in the rise of a single power capable of ending centuries of division. The Zhou kings would fade, but the civilization they had shaped would continue, transformed by the forces that their decline had unleashed. The last centuries of the Zhou dynasty unfolded under the shadow of irrelevance. While the warring states struggled for supremacy, the royal family lingered in Luoyang, diminished and largely powerless, yet never fully extinguished. The title of Son of Heaven still rested upon the Zhou kings, but it had become a ceremonial inheritance, stripped of the substance of command. The lords of Qin, Chu, Zhao, Wei, Han, Qi, and Yan directed the course of events, raising armies, making alliances, and annexing lands, while the Zhou monarchs looked on from their reduced court. the royal family itself grew divided, fragmented, and dependent upon the goodwill of stronger states. Their decline was not sudden, but a long, lingering process in which each generation lost a little more authority until only the faint outline of kingship remained. The decline of the Zhou kingship had been set in motion centuries earlier, when the Western Zhou fell to nomadic attack and the dynasty retreated eastward. The relocation to Luoyang had preserved continuity, but at the cost of power. Over time, the court became less a centre of decision-making than a stage where old rituals were performed for the sake of tradition. The royal family maintained temples, sacrifices, and investiture ceremonies, but these gestures carried little weight with the great powers that surrounded them. The dynasty endured because no state wished to abolish it outright, for the Zhou name still provided a veneer of legitimacy, yet this endurance masked the reality that the kings were increasingly irrelevant to the affairs of the realm. The royal family itself weakened from within. As power dwindled, so too did the cohesion of the lineage. The kings no longer commanded large armies or vast estates, and their ability to reward loyalty diminished. Rival branches of the family competed for influence, sometimes even producing rival claimants to the throne. The king's position, once unchallenged, became precarious, vulnerable to the manipulations of surrounding states. Princes quarrelled, nobles schemed, and the throne itself became dependent on the protection and recognition of whichever power was strongest at the time. The title of Son of Heaven survived, but it was reduced to a token handed from one fragile monarch to the next. The chronicles record the names of kings in this final era, but their reigns were marked more by obscurity than by accomplishment. Some are remembered only for brief mentions, their actions overshadowed by the wars and reforms of the great states. Others are noted for their reliance on this or that lord, a reminder that their survival depended on external patronage. The kings became shadows, their authority existing more in ritual memory than in practical reality. They presided over sacrifices, received envoys, and issued titles, but the lords who visited Luoyang did so more out of courtesy than obligation. The kingship had become an echo sustained by habit rather than power. One of the clearest signs of decline was the division of the royal family itself. In the 4th century BCE, the House of Zhou split into two rival courts, later remembered as the Eastern Zhou and Western Zhou branches, each claiming the title of king. These rival lines reflected the extent to which the dynasty had lost coherence. The kings could not prevent division within their own lineage, nor could they command recognition from the states around them. Some lords supported one branch, others the rival, but few regarded either with real authority. The splitting of the royal house symbolized the hollowing out of kingship, reducing the dynasty to a quarrel among weak claimants. The royal court at Luoyang became a place of ceremony without power. The kings continued to perform sacrifices to heaven and the ancestors, maintaining the forms of the mandate of heaven. They presided over rituals that hearkened back to the grandeur of the Western Zhou, with music, offerings, and bronze vessels. Yet these ceremonies rang hollow in an age when the real determinants of power were armies, fortifications, and bureaucratic reforms. The kings remained important as symbols, for the idea of heaven's mandate still carried weight, but the substance of kingship had passed to others. In this sense, they became shadow kings, presiding over shadows of rituals while the light of authority had moved elsewhere. The decline of the royal family was also evident in their reduced resources. Once supported by tribute from across the realm, the kings now controlled only the small domain around Luoyang. Their revenues were meagre compared to those of Qin, Chu, or Qi, and their ability to support armies was negligible. Even the maintenance of their court became difficult, and they relied increasingly on gifts or subsidies from stronger states. This dependency eroded their dignity, for the Son of Heaven was no longer the benefactor, but the supplicant. The kings endured only because it suited the great powers to let them endure. Despite their weakness, the kings remained a part of the political theatre of the age. Ambitious rulers sometimes sought their sanction, inviting envoys from Luoyang to witness proclamations or sending tribute to reinforce appearances of loyalty. The kings issued titles and seals, gestures that mattered more for form than substance. A lord might be proclaimed hegemon or acknowledged as legitimate by the Zhou king, but everyone knew that the real legitimacy came from the size of his armies and the strength of his reforms. The kings became players in the diplomatic games of the warring states, their role reduced to a prop in the ambitions of others. The image of shadow kings also carried a moral dimension. Later thinkers, especially those influenced by Confucian ideals, portrayed the decline of the Zhou royal family as a lesson in the consequences of losing virtue. The Western Zhou had flourished, they said, because its rulers had governed with moral authority and reverence for heaven. The Eastern Zhou had declined because its kings had neglected virtue, allowed disorder, and become dependent on others. The image of powerless kings presiding over hollow rituals became a symbol of moral failure, a warning that the mandate of heaven could not be preserved by ceremony alone. The final generations of Zhou kings saw their dynasty reduced to near extinction. Their names were recorded, but their deeds were few, for they had little power to act. The warring states continued their battles, reforms and alliances without reference to Luoyang. The kings lived in obscurity, their court diminished, their family divided, their rituals a faint echo of the grandeur that had once bound the realm together. They lingered in the shadow of history, sustained by habit and memory, but deprived of substance. The end of the dynasty came in the 3rd century BCE, when Qin, ascendant after generations of legalist reforms and military victories, finally swept away the last vestiges of Zhou authority. By then, the kingship had become so weakened that its elimination passed with little resistance. The royal family that had once claimed the mandate of heaven for centuries was absorbed into the tide of conquest, their name preserved only as a memory. The shadow kings had presided over decline until nothing remained but the shadow itself. Yet even in decline, the Zhou dynasty left a lasting imprint. The persistence of their kingship, however diminished, preserved the framework of legitimacy that shaped the ambitions of the warring states. Their survival as shadows allowed the idea of heaven's mandate to endure until it could be claimed by a new dynasty. The Zhou royal family, reduced and forgotten, still provided the thread of continuity that connected the Western Zhou Golden Age to the unification of China under Qin. Their decline was a tragedy of power lost, but it was also a testament to the endurance of ideas over the frailty of rulers. By the 3rd century BCE, the Zhou dynasty had been reduced to a faint echo of the grandeur it once embodied. The kings still sat in Luoyang, still performed sacrifices, and still bore the title of Son of Heaven, but the world around them had changed beyond recognition. The warring states had grown into formidable powers, centralized, disciplined, and relentless in their pursuit of supremacy. For centuries they had tolerated the presence of the Zhou kings, preserving the facade of continuity even as they ignored royal commands. But by the final decades of the dynasty, even the symbolic value of the Zhou throne had waned. The time had come for one state to extinguish the old order altogether and replace it with something new. That state was Qin. Qin had once been a marginal domain on the western frontier, regarded with suspicion by the more established states of the Central Plains. Its rulers traced their lineage to servants of the Zhou royal house, and for centuries Qin had played the role of loyal guardian of the dynasty's western flank. Yet its peripheral position gave it both resilience and opportunity. Protected by mountains and rivers, Qin was less vulnerable to sudden conquest, and its rulers had the freedom to experiment with reforms that would eventually propel them to dominance. Under the guidance of Shang and other reformers, Qin transformed itself from a backward frontier into the most disciplined and centralized state in the Chinese world. The legalist reforms implemented in Qin reshaped its society from the ground up. Hereditary aristocracy was curtailed, and officials were appointed based on merit and performance. Land was redistributed, ensuring that peasants had clear obligations to the state rather than to local nobles. Households were registered, taxes standardized, and military service became both a duty and a path to advancement. Qin rewarded those who farmed diligently and fought bravely, while punishing idleness and disobedience with severity. These measures created a society organized for efficiency, where every household contributed directly to the strength of the state. Qin's military innovations gave it decisive advantages. Its armies were vast, disciplined, and well equipped with iron weapons and crossbows. The state invested heavily in infrastructure, building roads and canals to move troops and supplies quickly across its territory. Fortifications secured its borders, and generals were appointed for their ability rather than their lineage. The combination of legalist administration and military power made Qin uniquely capable of sustained conquest. Unlike other states, which often remained entangled in aristocratic rivalries and internal divisions, Qin presented a united front under the command of its rulers. By the mid-3rd century BCE, Qin's ambitions were clear. It sought not merely survival or dominance within a balance of power, but the complete unification of the realm under its own rule. Its leaders invoked the mandate of heaven, portraying their victories as signs of divine favour. The Zhou kings, still lingering in Luoyang, offered no resistance, for they lacked the means to do so. In 256 BCE, Qin armies marched into the Zhou domain itself, extinguishing the last remnant of royal power. King Nan of Zhou, the final monarch, was deposed, and the ancestral temples of Luoyang fell silent. After more than 8 centuries, the Zhou dynasty had come to an end. The fall of the Zhou was not marked by a climactic battle or dramatic resistance. It was a quiet extinguishing, the inevitable conclusion of centuries of decline. The kings had long since ceased to play a meaningful role in the politics of the realm, and their elimination passed almost unnoticed amid the greater struggles of the warring states. Qin absorbed their lands and their legacy, proclaiming itself the rightful heir to heaven's mandate. The dynasty that had once overthrown the Shang by invoking the mandate was now itself overthrown, its fate serving as a stark reminder that heaven's favour was conditional and could shift to any ruler capable of restoring order. The rise of Qin was more than the fall of Zhou. It was the culmination of the transformations that had unfolded throughout the Eastern Zhou era. The centralization of power, the decline of aristocracy, the expansion of bureaucracy, the professionalization of armies, and the spread of legalist principles all reached their apex in Qin. Where the Zhou had ruled through kinship and ritual, Qin ruled through law and force. Where the Zhou kings had served as mediators between heaven and humanity, the Qin rulers sought to embody absolute authority. The old feudal order was swept aside, replaced by a new vision of empire that no longer relied on symbolic kingship but on direct control. The memory of the Zhou dynasty, however, did not disappear with its fall. Even as Qin established its dominance, the Zhou legacy remained embedded in Chinese culture. The mandate of heaven, the rites, and the memory of Western Zhou harmony continued to influence thought. Confucian scholars looked back to Zhou rituals as models of moral governance, contrasting them with the harshness of Qin. Philosophers debated the lessons of Zhou decline, seeing in it both the dangers of neglecting virtue and the inevitability of political transformation. The dynasty lived on in memory, even as its institutions had been dismantled. For the Zhou royal family, the end was final. The line that had traced its ancestry to Huji, the lord of millet, and had ruled as sons of heaven for centuries, was reduced to obscurity. The temples that had once resounded with ritual music stood abandoned, their vessels scattered or melted down. The kings who had once presided over feasts and sacrifices became names in chronicles, their deeds overshadowed by the rise of Qin. The shadow kings of the final centuries had preserved continuity, but they had also presided over decline, leaving little behind but the lesson of impermanence. Qin's conquest of Zhou was not only the end of a dynasty but the end of an era. The Zhou had defined Chinese civilization for centuries, establishing the concepts of heaven's mandate, ritual order, and hierarchical governance that shaped the culture. Their decline had created the conditions for intellectual ferment, political innovation, and the rise of powerful states. Their fall marked the close of the feudal age and the beginning of imperial rule. In this sense, the Zhou did not vanish, they transformed into the foundation upon which all subsequent dynasties built. The rise of Qin was therefore both a rupture and a continuation. It broke decisively with Zhou traditions of decentralized rule, imposing a centralized empire unprecedented in scope, yet it also claimed to inherit the Zhou's legacy, presenting itself as the rightful successor to the mandate of heaven. The Zhou kings had faded into shadows, but the idea they embodied remained central, ensuring that their influence extended far beyond their fall. The dynasty was gone, but its memory lived on, shaping the empire that rose in its place. The fall of the Zhou did not end their significance, for their legacy endured long after their dynasty had vanished from the political map. The Zhou had reigned for centuries, shaping the institutions, beliefs and ideals that defined Chinese civilization. Their kings no longer ruled, their ancestral temples had fallen silent, and their lands had been absorbed into the expanding dominion of Qin, yet the memory of their order persisted. It lived on in texts, in rituals, in philosophy, and in the imagination of later generations, who looked back to the Zhou as both a golden age and a cautionary tale. The influence of their ideas extended across millennia, ensuring that the Zhou remained a central reference point in the unfolding story of China. The doctrine of the mandate of heaven was perhaps their most enduring contribution. First articulated to justify their conquest of the Shang, it became the standard by which all subsequent dynasties explained their rise and fall. The mandate held that heaven granted legitimacy to rulers who governed with virtue and withdrew it from those who ruled unjustly. Natural disasters, rebellions, and defeats were interpreted as signs that heaven had abandoned a dynasty. This doctrine created a moral framework for political change, legitimizing rebellion when rulers failed and sanctifying new dynasties when they succeeded. The Zhou had invented a concept flexible enough to explain their own ascent and, ultimately, their own demise, and it remained central to Chinese political thought for more than 2,000 years. Equally influential was the Zhou system of ritual. The Western Zhou in particular had codified elaborate ceremonies of sacrifice, feasting, music and hierarchy. These rituals bound the aristocracy together, reinforced social order and articulated the relationship between humans, ancestors and heaven. Though the political power of the Zhou kings faded, the memory of their rites endured, preserved in texts like the Book of Rites. Confucius and his followers looked back to the Zhou ceremonies as the model of moral governance, a vision of harmony that contrasted with the disorder of their own times. For centuries, scholars, officials and rulers studied and imitated Zhou rituals, using them as a template for family life, court ceremonies, and state governance. In this way, the Zhou rites became not only a memory, but a living tradition, shaping conduct long after the dynasty's fall. The Zhou also left a lasting imprint on the structure of society. Their feudal system, though it eventually broke down, established the idea of hierarchical order that endured in new forms. The distribution of land to relatives and allies, the emphasis on loyalty and service, and the division of responsibilities between central and local authorities all influenced later systems of governance. Even when dynasties abandoned feudal decentralization in favor of centralization, they continued to use Zhou titles, rituals, and concepts of hierarchy. The language of feudal kinship remained part of the political vocabulary, a reminder of the Zhou origins of Chinese statecraft. The intellectual legacy of the Zhou age was equally profound. The Eastern Zhou's turmoil had produced the 100 schools of thought, whose philosophers shaped Chinese civilization for centuries. Confucius drew upon the memory of Zhou rituals to construct his vision of moral governance. Whilst he criticized Zhou extravagance while preserving the concern for order and welfare, Laozi rejected ritual in favor of natural simplicity, but his teachings emerged in response to the world the Zhou had created. Legalist thinkers built upon the lessons of Zhou decline, arguing for strict laws and centralized control. All of these schools define themselves in relation to the Zhou legacy, whether by affirming, rejecting, or transforming it. In this way, the Zhou dynasty became the intellectual backdrop against which Chinese philosophy was born. The Zhou period also left material legacies. The bronze vessels of the Western Zhou, inscribed with dedications and proclamations, preserved records of politics, ritual, and culture. These artifacts, unearthed centuries later, testified to the sophistication of Zhou artisanship and the centrality of ritual in their society. The inscriptions revealed the concerns of rulers and nobles, their invocations of heaven, their commemorations of service, and their declarations of legitimacy. Such objects became treasured by later generations, collected, studied, and imitated as symbols of cultural heritage. The artistry of Zhou bronzes, with their patterns of Taoti masks and symmetrical designs, set standards that influenced later Chinese art. The agricultural and technological practices of the Zhou also shaped Chinese development. Their cultivation of millet, wheat, and rice, their domestication of animals, their techniques of bronze and later ironworking, all contributed to the foundations of Chinese economy. The Zhou emphasis on productivity and surplus, tied to ritual and tribute, established patterns of resource management that persisted in later dynasties. The integration of economy and ideology, in which agriculture was linked to cosmic harmony and political legitimacy, endured in Chinese thought, shaping how rulers conceived their responsibilities to the land and the people. The Zhou dynasty also contributed to the shaping of identity and memory. Later Chinese dynasties looked back to the Zhou as the beginning of their civilization's moral and political traditions. The Western Zhou was idealized as an age of harmony, where rulers governed with virtue and rituals aligned humanity with heaven. The Eastern Zhou was remembered as an age of decline, where kings lost authority, feudal lords grew arrogant, and order collapsed into warfare. This narrative of rise and fall became a framework through which later ages interpreted their own times. By comparing themselves to the Zhou, later dynasties justified their policies, warned against excess, and invoked the mandate of heaven. Even the dynasty's decline became part of its legacy. The image of shadow kings in Luoyang, powerless and irrelevant, served as a cautionary tale for later rulers. Confucian scholars cited their failures as examples of what happened when virtue was neglected, rituals performed mechanically, and power allowed to drift into the hands of ambitious lords. The memory of the Zhou's long, slow collapse reinforced the belief that dynasties survived only if rulers maintained moral authority. In this sense, the Zhou lived on not only as a model, but as a warning. The Zhou period also left behind a political geography that influenced the future of China. The feudal enfeoffments, the rise of states like Jin, Chu, Qi, and Qin, the eventual consolidation of the warring states, all of these developments emerged from the Zhou order. Even as states broke away from the king, they continued to operate within a framework that the Zhou had created. The eventual unification under Qin built directly upon the structures and rivalries that had evolved during Zhou rule. Thus, even in their decline, the Zhou shaped the conditions of their successors. The endurance of Zhou traditions can be seen in the persistence of ancestor worship. The Zhou had emphasized sacrifices to ancestors as the foundation of legitimacy, linking the living to the past and binding families into lineages. This practice did not vanish with the dynasty, but became a permanent feature of Chinese culture. Families across all regions continued to maintain ancestral tablets, perform sacrifices, and revere their forebears. The connection between political authority and ancestral worship, so central to Zhou ideology, became part of the Chinese worldview for millennia. The Zhou also left a legacy in their conception of the ruler's role. By defining the king as the son of heaven, responsible for mediating between the human and the divine, they established a model of kingship that persisted through later dynasties. Even as emperors replaced kings, the idea that the ruler held a sacred responsibility to heaven and to the people endured. This conception shaped the expectations placed upon rulers and the justifications for rebellion when they failed. The Zhou kings may have faded into history, but the role they defined continued to structure Chinese political culture. In the centuries that followed the fall of Zhou, dynasties rose and fell, each invoking the mandate of heaven, each performing rituals rooted in Zhou traditions, each comparing itself to the memory of Zhou harmony and decline. The Zhou dynasty, though long gone, remained present in every act of governance, every philosophical debate, and every interpretation of history. Their legacy was not confined to the past, but lived on in the very fabric of Chinese civilization, shaping its values, institutions, and self-understanding. Thus the Zhou dynasty, though it ended in shadows, became one of the most influential in Chinese history. Its contributions to political thought, ritual, philosophy, and culture continued to guide China long after its kings had vanished. The dynasty's fall was not the end of its story, but the beginning of its memory, a memory that endured across ages, shaping how China understood itself and its place in the order of heaven and earth.